shouting for no one to leave. G-Dog pulled out his gun, pointed at the cop, and said, "The only one who isn't going to leave is you, mother." The crowd scattered. Atwood and his friends hid in another apartment. The police began going door to door in the complex as helicopters shone down spotlights. There was a sudden pounding on the French window at the back of the apartment, and assumed it was the cops. But it was G-Dog asking for shelter. Atwood agreed, and the group spent the rest of the night silently hiding in the apartment in the dark. Sometime later, the police knocked at the door, but they eventually left after there was no response. The next morning, Atwood drove G-Dog home, and thanks for hiding him, G-Dog pledged that he and his brothers would have Atwood's back. At first, Atwood had no idea what this meant. A few months later, G-Dog invited Atwood to come meet his brothers. Atwood found himself at a New Mexican mafia hangout, full of guys in sagging pants, chains, and tattoos. A TV showed CCTV footage of the surrounding area. Next to it was the biggest TV Atwood had ever seen. On top of the huge TV, the gang displayed their rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Atwood was terrified, but relaxed when the group joked with him and offered him protection. The rave scene in Arizona was growing. Atwood expanded his drug dealing business. He sold mainly ecstasy, but also Special K and LSD. He began ordering several thousand ecstasy tablets at a time from his LA connection. He hired a team of people to work for him and paid them in cash, cars, and apartments. Eventually, Atwood wanted to bypass his dealer in LA and purchase straight from the source. He found out that the ecstasy was being made some 5,000 miles away in Amsterdam, Holland. With his fraudulent visa, Atwood realized he couldn't leave the US, so he sent some of his employees to Europe on fact-finding missions. Happy with the samples they brought back, Atwood began testing different methods of smuggling the drugs. At first, Atwood's mules only carried around 5,000 pills at a time, but as they became more confident, they smuggled up to 40,000 pills per mission. Mainly, his employees would go to Germany or France and then take the train to Amsterdam. They would fly back to North America via Mexico and then smuggle the drugs over the US border. The drugs were hidden in luggage, computer towers, or vitamin bottles. Atwood imported ecstasy at $3 a pill from Holland and sold it for $10 a pill to his team of sellers. By 1999, Atwood had amassed a drug-dealing empire. Hundreds of people worked for him. He was the biggest ecstasy dealer in Arizona. Atwood became nicknamed the Bank of England because he had so much money. He was also dubbed the Wolf of Witness, a play on the Wolf of Wall Street. Atwood's main enforcers were his childhood pal Wildman and his New Mexican mafia buddy G-Dog. To support his operation, Atwood came up with an elaborate money laundering system, flying old friends over from Witness to the US to set up bank accounts, which he then used for illegal activities. At the height of his operation, Atwood had his own rave clothing line, a music store, and a personal LSD chemist. He lived among the very rich in an opulent mountainside mansion with his third wife, a topless dancer and internet porn star. He traveled by limo and acquired several luxury apartments, one of which was just to store his ill-gotten gains. Atwood was taking drugs as well as selling them. He took upwards of 10 ecstasy pills every weekend, as well as GHB, crystal meth, Valium, Xanax, and ketamine. Atwood's chaotic life was peppered with extreme moments of paranoia. It wasn't just the drugs. Salvatore Gravano, aka Sammy the Bull, a former henchman for the Gambino crime family who had once testified against John Gotti, set up a rival ecstasy distribution ring. Sammy took a hit out on Atwood and once plotted to kidnap him from a nightclub, but Atwood managed to foil his plans. In late 2000, the dot-com bubble burst and Atwood's stocks lost most of their value. Meanwhile, Atwood struggled to maintain order among his crew, quite often playing referee to their squabbles. Most of his squad was doing so much crystal meth they were growing reckless, paranoid, and plotting against each other. A few of his employees were caught smuggling drugs at airports around the world. Eventually, Atwood fell in love. His new girlfriend, Claudia, who wasn't into the rave scene, convinced him to stop his wild ways. Tired of the havoc, Atwood began to wind down his partying and slow his drug use. Furthermore, Atwood stopped dealing and tried to rid himself of his connections to his ecstasy empire. He moved in with Claudia and began to improve his life, but it was too late. For the last 5 years, Atwood had been under federal investigation, complete with undercover cops following him and thousands of wiretaps. The DEA, U.S. Customs, and 3 Arizona police forces created a joint task force to bring Atwood down. Furthermore, the police were able to get 10 witnesses to come forward to testify against Atwood. On a quiet spring day in 2002, the police finally arrested Atwood. Naively, Atwood thought he had to be caught red-handed with drugs in order to get arrested. Per Arizonian laws, the police had 7 years to convict for any drug offense committed. and they do not require physical evidence of the drugs themselves. All of Atwood's assets were seized by the state of Arizona. Atwood was remanded to the notoriously tough Maricopa County Jail, run by controversial Sheriff Joe Arpaio. For the next 26 months, he lived in a tiny maximum security cell with 2 steel bunks and a seatless toilet. Atwood struggled to survive the brutal conditions at the jail, including extreme heat, cockroaches, rotten food, violent inmates, and murderous guards. Drug smuggling was common, with many prisoners addicted to crystal meth or heroin. Stabbings, assault, and rape were frequent. Gangs had more control over the jail than the guards did. To deal with stress, Atwood began keeping a journal. On bits of paper, he wrote entries using a golf pencil sharpened on his cell door. His aunt visited him frequently, and she would smuggle out his writings. She would then type them up and email them to Atwood's parents. Atwood's father, Derek, created a blog called John's Jail Journal and would post entries there. He kept the blog anonymous since Atwood feared reprisal from the guards. Eventually, the popular blog began to draw media interest worldwide as the dangerous conditions at Maricopa County Jail were exposed. After serving over 2 years prior to sentencing, Atwood signed a plea bargain admitting guilt for drug dealing and money laundering. He was sentenced to 9.5 years, thereby avoiding a maximum 200-year jail sentence if his case had gone to trial. In July of 2004, Atwood was moved to the Arizona Department of Corrections to serve out his time. His living conditions improved, although the prisoners were just as violent and dangerous as the ones he left behind. Atwood continued to write John's Jail Journal blog entries for now, more about the unique, colorful prisoners he met rather than his living conditions. In prison, Atwood attended therapy and read voraciously, starting with classic literature. He studied psychology and philosophy to help him better understand himself and his life choices. Atwood claims he read around 1,000 books in just over 6 years. Atwood was released in December of 2007 after having served about 6 years of his sentence. He was deported to the UK and banned from the US for life. Temporarily, Atwood moved back in with his parents and initially struggled to adjust to life post-prison. Cocaine was trendy in the UK, and various connections kept calling Atwood asking for his help in establishing a cocaine import business to the UK. Atwood continued to write and in 2008 won a short story competition with an entry about prison life. As a result of his win, Atwood was assigned an author to mentor him. Several months later, Atwood received a publishing deal for his first book, which was about his experience in America's toughest jail. Since then, Sean Atwood has published several books about drugs and the prison system, including 2 more books regarding his wild life of drug dealing and subsequent punishment. He continues to update John's Jail blog, publishing letters he's received from prisoners. He also campaigns for humane jail conditions. In addition to being an author, Atwood is a speaker who's given TED Talks and also has spoken to school children across the UK and Europe about drugs and the consequences of his lifestyle. He hopes to prevent youths from making the same mistakes he did. Atwood feels the speeches he makes and the guidance he offers atones for his former life more than the incarceration sentence he served. What are some ways you think recidivism can be lessened? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called The White American.
What the hell? I just spit.
I'm gentleman dog.
Careful. Oh,
You can take one. Cheese.
sounds more cheese, yo.
in a half funny way because you're thinking, why would McDonald's do this? Doesn't that commercial look amateur? Like it's fake? Well, a lot of people are saying that it's real, but it just looks like someone has filmed, some kids have just randomly had some fun and filmed a fake McDonald's commercial. Imagine the budget for that. Literally less than $100.
The clown, I don't really hate the clown. The clown is weird. I wouldn't want to let my kid watch any of those commercials.
No, I would let them watch it because then they wouldn't want to eat fast food. This is a good way to make your child eat healthy.
Yeah. What? Where did you get that from? Cheeseburger? The commercial worked on you. They have you. No! No! Don't! Wake up!
Number 2, Kleenex.
Again?
We've already covered this commercial in our Japanese urban legends video, but the whole story about it is so creepy. You know, we had to include it.
It's a fine day, people open windows, they leave their houses just for a short while. They walk by the grass and they look at the grass, they look at the sky. It's going to be a fine night tonight. It's going to be a fine day tomorrow.
Kleenex tissue desu.
So weird. Whoever came up with that, I don't know.
I don't think we should talk too much about this because we already kind of went over it in that video, so you can check that video out if you want to know the backstory about this commercial, because it's quite interesting. Because it's not just simply a creepy commercial. There's an urban legend associated with the commercial. People were apparently cursed, people apparently died, and it's just...
And they look at the grass, they look at the sky. It's going to be a fine night tonight. It's going to be a fine day.
all around pretty creepy. Number 3, drawings.
You have some cheese there on your lips. Where's the Kleenex? Commercial about drawings. Okay.
みんなの心に浮かんだことをそのまま書けばいいんだからね。
Drawing black.
It's like KFC guy.
Whale.
The child protection commercial.
It's creepy. It's creepy.
It's creepy, right?
It's creepy, yeah.
Might not be scary, but it's like, what's going on here?
What's up with him?
I'm just thinking, watching the end, has that kid heard of scale models? The intention is good, right? But do you think it's a good idea to make the commercial with such a message creepy? Does that actually help?
I don't know.
Yeah, wouldn't that be kind of counter? You'd want to make children and that drawings and... All right, how about caution, see? That got me, even though I watched that before. Save the best for last. Let's watch it again.
No!
On her arms and elbows. The boy was filled with terror. He tried to run, but he was frozen.
You accompany her from that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think she creates an army of people like her. I don't think it's like it's not like The Walking Dead.
The Walking Teke.
I'm gonna do that tonight.
Yeah,
I'm gonna do that tonight at like 3 a.m. Wake you up. All right, so this next urban legend is called Cursed Kleenex Commercial.
What?
So back in the 1980s in Japan, common exchange between two people could have been, excuse me, can you pass me a tissue? All right. Oh wait, hang on. That's not a Kleenex tissue, is it? You don't even know what the hell that was. All right, I'll tell you why. During the 1980s, Kleenex launched an impressive ad campaign. The main characters in the ad were a woman in white and a young boy dressed up as a tiny ogre. The music for the ad was It's a Fine Day by Jane and Barton. All was not fine, however. Perhaps because the song was in a foreign tongue, rumors started to circulate that the tune was that of a German curse.
German curse?
I don't know how they made that connection. I don't know. I guess the song was in English.
Yeah.
And they just didn't know English very well. I don't know.
But they did. So.
Basically, the song was creepy to them. And it was not in Japanese. It was in some Germanic language. And as a result, many viewers found the ad disturbing. And several complaints were made to the broadcasting company. The ad was eventually pulled. But as soon as it was, the legends came thick and fast. The actress in the ad, Keiko Matsuzaka, was allegedly driven mad. The young child playing the ogre died mysteriously. Every member of the crew that worked on the ad subsequently died. That's probably not what Kleenex was going for. Yeah, that's weird. Do you want to see the commercial? Ready? Right.
I think so.
It's a fine day, people open windows. It's going to be a fine day tomorrow. Kleenex tissue desu.
Kleenex tissue desu.
So creepy. Well, why? Who would think of that kind of a commercial?
Can you imagine them in the board meeting? I have an idea for this commercial. It's that. It's so weird.
The kid is probably traumatized now.
Dude, the kid's apparently dead. I'm sure you could check that. No, the crew died. They died, man. They died.
Tissue desk. That's the creepiest commercial I've ever seen.
Kleenex tissue desu.
Nina, Kleenex tissue desu. The next story, so that was 2, number 3 now.
Okay.
The third urban legend is called Cowhead. So, according to legend, a horrific short story called Cowhead was discovered in Japan in the 17th century. The actual origin of the story is still shrouded in mystery. So rumors state that upon hearing the dreadful tale, listeners were overcome with a terror so great that they trembled violently for days until they finally died from fright. The Cowhead story was deemed too dangerous, and most existing copies of it were burned years ago. Today, it's believed that only fragments of the original story remain in existence. Most of the actual details of the story remain unknown to this day. Apparently, there was an elementary school teacher who came into possession of some fragments of the original Cowhead story. The teacher was taking his class on a school trip. Now, he had the habit of entertaining his students by telling ghost stories. On this particular trip, he would tell them about the legendary forbidden tale called Cowhead. Before he could finish the first sentence of the story, the children began to panic. "Stop," they cried. "Don't tell us." But the teacher refused to stop. They say his eyes were blank, and he proceeded with the story as if some unseen force had taken over his mind and body. Almost an hour later, the teacher regained his senses and found that the bus had crashed into a ditch. The students had all fainted and were frothing at the mouth. It is unclear what happened next, except that the teacher was told never to tell the Cowhead story again. The whole story doesn't exist, but Fragments of it are still around. And apparently someone found, and it's in Japanese. So this is a translation of a fragment of this cow head story. The actual cow head story. Maybe it's fine because it's translated. Let's test it out. There's a little deserted village in the middle of nowhere. Archaeologists are digging to find out why nobody lives there. They unearth a weird skeleton with the head of a cow and the body of a man. They do research and find out that years before, there was a famine. Back before, everybody in the village was starving. They would eat cows and horses. They would eat their pets. One day, a strange figure wanders into the village. He has the head of a cow and the body of a man. The starving villagers attack him and brutally kill him, ripping him limb from limb before eating him. That's when the villages became cursed. And that's just one fragment of the story. That wasn't nice. That wasn't just that.
But it was
The next urban legend is called the Slit-Mouthed Woman. So, this woman, she walks the streets of Japan, and apparently she hunts for children. Okay, picture this scene. You're walking home from school, and your path takes you down a deserted city street. Suddenly you hear a faint noise coming from the shadows. You glance over and see a beautiful woman standing there. She has long black hair and is wearing a trench coat. A surgical mask covers the lower half of her face. She steps out of the shadows and blocks your path. Then she asks,
Am I beautiful?
but before you can answer, she tears off her mask, revealing a hideously deformed face. Her huge mouth is sliced from ear to ear, like the Joker.
Like a Joker, yeah.
She opens her mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth and a big, red, disgusting tongue, twisting and twirling inside. Am I beautiful now? She screams. Terrified, you struggle to answer her. If you say no to her question, am I beautiful? Which would be the honest answer to her question. She pulls out a huge pair of scissors, chopping off your head. If you decide to say, yes, you are beautiful, which you might think, oh, this might save me, she takes her scissors and slices your mouth from ear to ear, making you look just like her, to make you look as beautiful as her.
That's creepy.
So yeah, that's basically the story. So the slit-mouthed woman's reign of terror began in the spring of 1979 in Japan, when rumors began to spread throughout about sightings of this woman who hunts children. Well, we're safe. We're not children.
Yes.
We're okay. The story kind of spread like wildfire and actually created scares in many towns.
Really?
Yeah, back in 1979. The police increased their patrols and schools sent teachers to walk students home in groups. So I think it had a real life effect. The interesting thing is, in 2007, a coroner found some old records back from the 1970s about a woman who was chasing little children. Now, this is apparently real. This was in the records. But she was hit by a car, and she died shortly after.
Dolls. Dolls are so scary.
In 1918, a 17-year-old boy by the name of Eikichi Suzuki purchased a doll for his baby sister Okiku. The doll itself was clad in a traditional Japanese kimono, and the black hair in a traditional style cut shoulder length. The overjoyed little girl was smitten with the doll and played with it every day. The two were reportedly inseparable. That makes it seem like the doll was alive. The following year, Okiku fell gravely ill. She had a high fever, and soon afterwards, she died. The family was in mourning. They placed her beloved doll in a family altar in memory of Okiku. Not long later, they noticed something odd. The jet black hair of the doll, which had originally been neatly cut, shoulder length, started getting longer. Soon, the hair had grown all the way down to the doll's knees. They decided to trim the doll's long hair back to shoulder length. If I was them, I would not even touch the damn thing. Freaking hell. Soon afterwards, the hair inexplicably grew back. They believed their daughter's spirit resided within the doll. They brought it to the Manenji temple in the town of Iwamizawa, Hokkaido, Japan. The family explained the doll's unusual qualities to the temple priest. Despite this, he accepted the doll, and not long after, he witnessed for himself the growing black hair. Trimming of the doll's hair became a regular chore at the temple, and word soon spread across Japan of this hair-raising Okiku doll. To this day, the doll remains at the Manenji temple.
Oh, okay.
Its hair purportedly continues to grow no matter how often it is trimmed. I mean, it's saying it like it's real, so a sample of the Okiku doll's hair has been taken and analyzed in a lab, and it was determined that the hair was human hair.
Human hair.
Yeah.
That sounds real to me. That's the realest real story that I've heard.
Present day, today, anyone who wishes to take a look at the Okiku doll up close can see for themselves at the Manenji temple. It's on display. Do you want to see a picture of the Okiku doll?
I don't know. God. It's human hair. It's human hair.
Also come after a fall if it was when you go halfway. It's the half, I call it the half flip. The Andy half flip. Yeah, the Andy half flip. Everyone's going to be doing it soon and you'll be like, oh, I wish that it's fine. I told you it's supposed to be at this angle. I am proud of what you wait.
Extremely bad at baking, judging by the state of the rest of their cooking. Tentacly. Each of the bakers is a nasty piece of work in their own way, but it might have comforted you to know ahead of time that the final boss isn't the baker matriarch Marguerite, who is part woman, part beehive.
Now with me, we're gonna settle this!
Nor is it wayward son Lucas, who has a thing for cruel and unusual pranks.
I'm calling the game. I'd really like to make it out of this room alive and not die a horrible, painful death. I know, it's a camp title.
And it's not even patriarch Jack Baker, who is usually either on fire or brandishing a chainsaw.
What's the matter? You're out of it.
Instead, the final enemy you'll be facing is Evelyn. Evelyn, you remember, is the insensible old woman you find parked in a wheelchair at various points around the Baker family plantation. Given that by the end of Resident Evil 7 you're armed with enough pistols, shotguns and flamethrowers to reenact the finale of a Tarantino movie, you'd be forgiven for thinking this battle with an immobile old lady is going to be a pretty one-sided affair. I mean, you could probably just tip that wheelchair off a balcony and be done with it. Or set it rolling down the hill towards the bayou, let the gators sort it out.
That's horrible.
I had to eat tentacles. But that kind of overconfidence would prove to be your undoing, because it turns out that Evie here has another form. That's right, a small child.
Welcome to Magic School. Now that we've covered flying, let's talk about giant angels.
You're gonna be one of us. And then maybe you'll play nicely.
Yeah, I'm sticking with the gator plan. Or I would do if Evelyn didn't have a third and final form, which is a giant, horrifying mold monster ripped straight from a janitor's nightmares. You might be wondering how you're even supposed to go about fighting this thing when it's pissed off, impervious to regular weapons, and the size of a Pizza Hut. But you're forgetting that this is a Resident Evil game, and as such, someone will be along any second to throw you the exact weapon you need to defeat it.
Use it!
There we go. Still, a warning next time, Resident Evil. Jeez.
What are you doing in there?
Oh, thank God! Look, someone has to watch this object at all times, or it deviates. My shifter blazer never showed up. Can you help me?
Of all the kitchen appliances, the fridge is our favourite. That's where the food lives. So imagine our surprise and dismay to discover, deep inside the Federal Bureau of Control, in Remedy's control, a fridge that had turned to evil. We always thought the kettle would be the one to turn. The fridge in question is what is known in Control as an altered item, and it needs someone to constantly be looking at it, or else it will deviate, a term which here we can assume means something extremely bad.
Look away. I don't know what this thing will do. You have to get me out of here.
Of course, with us in charge of things now as the new director of the FBC, we're not going to stand for any evil fridges terrorizing our staff. So, full of the kind of confidence that only comes from having a magic gun and the power to psychically hurl chunks of masonry, we head over to give this fridge a stern talking to, and then, if that doesn't work, a hail of gunfire. It's a tough management style, but productivity's never been higher. Anyway, the first sign that this fridge might be more trouble than it initially appears is the fact that, once you've got the door to its containment cell unlocked, the guy posted inside to keep an eye on it is turned almost immediately into a red smear that probably won't be attending the company picnic this year.
If I look away, it hurts me.
Touching the fridge at this point transports us to the astral plane, where it becomes quickly apparent that the fridge was in fact host to an interdimensional creature called the Former. And the Former is a kind of spider-legged searchlight monster that can fire exploding balls out of its face. To be honest, that would explain why the milk keeps going off. This is a much, much tougher boss fight than we were anticipating when it first became clear we were going to have a fight with a fridge. And who knows what kind of horrifying monstrosities the other appliances are hiding. I've got my eye on you, buddy.
There's a reason that the Joker is Batman's most iconic arch-nemesis. He and the Dark Knight are two sides of the same coin. They're anarchy and chaos versus discipline and order. The Joker isn't a physically imposing figure, but the psychological threat he poses to Batman is incalculable.
He surrendered almost without a fight. I don't like it.
He's also just got some really, really solid jokes.
The joke's on you.
Classic. With that in mind, the Joker works best as a villain when he keeps Batman at arm's length, because if Batman gets close enough, he will use those arms to punch Joker in the face. By the end of Batman Arkham Asylum, having spent the whole game chasing Joker and trying to get close enough to take him down, you'll be anticipating a well-earned, one-sided beatdown.
Nicely done, Bats. You deserve a prize.
After all, up to this point, we've had to fight Bane, Zaz, Killer Croc, and about 300 powerlifting inmates. How much trouble are we going to have squaring off against a failed stand-up comedian who weighs 90 pounds wet?
I have nothing to live for.
Quite a lot, it turns out, because just before things kick off, Joker injects himself with Titan Formula. That's the experimental chemical based on the stuff that makes Bane massive and which transforms Joker from a spindly weakling into a Resident Evil boss with a mohawk. It seems to me that the world's greatest detective would deduce that having a fist fight with a giant mohawk monster made of insanity and steroids was a bad idea, and come back later in the Batwing to shoot everyone with machine guns. But I guess we're in it now.
Wasted the antidote on yourself. Now that's funny.
At least that's Joker defeated forever. 2 more games and a prequel.
Now, I'm not much of a fighter, but even I reckon I could take a flower in a fight. Most flowers. Maybe not one of those really big sunflowers. Situations like that, you just throw your wallet and run. So once it became clear that the main villain of Undertale was a flower, the imaginatively named Flowey, I, for one, eagerly awaited our inevitable confrontation. I mean, I know I'm just a weird-looking kid armed with the power of friendship, but even so, that's going to be a pretty one-sided fight. Just boot him in the petals, kick his stamen right off, stamp on his middle bit. I'm all out of flower anatomy. Your first sign that things maybe aren't going to go the way you expected is when you try to save the game and your precious save gets erased and then someone smashes a hole in the screen. And oh hey, here's Flowey, although he seems bigger than usual. And was he always manically vibrating like that? And oh good, he's eaten a bunch of human souls. Even better, it was Flowey who erased your save game, and he's going to save over it with your death, so you can endlessly repeat it, and man, this is some real nightmare fuel, not gonna lie. That's not even the worst of it, because here comes Flowey in his new form, Photoshop Flowey, who is a shuddering, crawling, hairy monstrosity with a horrible gnashing beak, tentacles, paws, way too many eyes, human teeth, a TV. I know how it is. I too got overexcited when I first learned how to use Photoshop. Flowey then subjects you to a bullet-hell nightmare of vines, flamethrowers, machine guns, and lasers that, if we're honest, had we known about prior to the fight, we might have negotiated our surrender. Oh hey, and he is reloading our death over and over so we can endlessly repeat it. Say what you will about Flowey, but he's a flower of his word. You got to respect that. I like those sunflowers. No honor.
Did you truly feign it all? That which bound us was a ruse.
Detlef, it's not that simple.
Oh no, it's very simple. You either deceived me or not.
Detlef is the main antagonist from Blood and Wine, which is an expansion for The Witcher 3 and two things that are really hard to get out of a white t-shirt. It turns out that Detlef has been on a brutal, murderous spree across Beauclair, earning him the name the Beast of Beauclair.
I saw a head popping, eyes bulging, the tongue blue and popped out. Next to it, a hand rocking.
There's not enough shellac in the whole world. Horrifying, yes, but you still might be thinking this bat-faced creep will be a manageable opponent. Well, prepare to choke on your hubris, because when you face Detlef again at the end of the game, he transforms once more, this time into what looks like the chestburster from Alien as reimagined for a Slayer album cover. At least Geralt's wearing dark colours. Smart guy.
Azoth is the essence of life. We alchemists have the ability to convert it into power. We can live forever. Your Azoth, Fiona, belongs to me.
Remember that bit in Resident Evil 4 where you free a dog from a trap and then later on it comes back and helps you in a boss fight?
Hey, it's that dog.
Haunting Ground for the PS2 is basically that, but an entire game. You play as Fiona, a young woman who wakes up after a car accident to find herself imprisoned in a spooky old castle.
Wait a minute. I remember being in the car with me.
Soon enough, you're joined by the aforementioned dog, a white German shepherd called Huey, and you must team up to escape the castle, avoiding and occasionally fighting various twisted and menacing enemies along the way. The final boss of the game, however, is an old man called Lorenzo, who you thought was helping you, but who actually turns out to be the villain of the piece. Also, he wants to kill you so he can become immortal. Also, I'm not sure he ever learned how to laugh properly. No, it's more like ha 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 ha. Okay, getting colder. Still, Lorenzo is extremely old, and as such, when it comes time to actually fight him, all he's able to do is crawl towards you, having long ago lost the use of his legs. But don't let that stop you crushing him in an industrial rock crusher. Better safe than sorry. That was a pretty easy final boss, you might be thinking, if you haven't watched any of the previous 5 entries in this video. If you have watched those, you can probably guess what's coming next. That's right, it's Lorenzo, and he's back! Only now he's young and basically invincible and has magic punches and can teleport. Also, he kicks the dog, and we definitely didn't sign up for that. What we did sign up for was pushing old men into rock crushers. We were very clear on the subject. Anyway, if you and Huey persevere, you can lure Lorenzo into the lava pit in the middle of the room. Now he's dead for sure, you might be thinking. And you'd be right. Except for the brief time he comes back as an on-fire skeleton. This skeleton Lorenzo can kill you with a single hit if he touches you, which, as escalating a situation goes, is pretty much checkmate. What did we do to deserve this? I mean, apart from pushing an old man into a rock crusher. Yeah, it was probably that, wasn't it? No, it's more like, ha ha, never mind.
When we think of vicars, we think of church garden parties, being bored at Sunday school, and tea and cake in the vicarage parlour. So you can imagine our sense of relief as we approached Vicar Amelia in Bloodborne after the harrowing time we'd had reaching the Grand Cathedral. Surely she'll offer us a cup of tea and a Bakewell slice, we thought, stupidly. Because Vicar Amelia looks anything but dangerous when you find her knelt in quiet prayer. She's probably the least terrifying thing you've seen in the game so far, and I'm sure there's nothing suspicious at all about this large boss fight-sized room she's waiting in. Approach Vicar Amelia to perhaps ask for directions to the nearest exit from this accursed Hell City, though, and she'll transform gorily into a sort of massive and monstery Afghan hound. In beast form, Amelia is a hairy nightmare, leaping around the cathedral and clawing you to bloody ribbons, which never happened at any of the vicarage garden parties I went to. I'm beginning to think we're not going to get that Bakewell slice.
Feels good. It's the good feeling of the half flip. For more information on the half flip, if a video game is popular and well-loved enough, sometimes they will get a re-release on a new system, giving developers a unique opportunity to make some changes for the better, or sometimes for the worse. Doom! Modern games are updated all the time through patches, providing little tweaks, but what we're interested in today are the developers who took the opportunity offered by a full-on re-release of their games to amend some pretty major issues.
Detective who spent his time solving crimes, being rude to people, and occasionally falling into tar pits. The being rude to people part, however, wasn't always intentional. That was because L.A. Noire's interrogation system boiled your responses to the people you were talking to down to 3 possible options: truth, doubt, or lie.
What makes you say that about Morgan, ma'am?
He's the foreman at my husband's plant. Very shady character.
On the surface, these options seem pretty self-explanatory. If you think someone is telling the truth, you choose truth. If you're not sure and need some more information or something clarifying, you choose doubt. And if you think they're lying, you choose lie. Simple, right, Cole?
I was down at the 111 Club this morning, waiting for the medical examiner to scrape Eddie McGoldrick's brains off the bar. You want to tell me anything about that?
Not simple, it turns out, because Cole is apparently a barely controlled rage monster who will fly off the handle at the slightest provocation, leading to responses like this, when you just want to ask an old lady to clarify her statement regarding the time her tenant arrived home.
A nosy old hag like you knows everything about the people who live under her roof. Where did she go?
Nice, Cole. Given that interrogating people was approximately 70% of what you do in LA Noire, not knowing whether Cole was going to ask the suspect if they knew the victim well or insult their mother made things a bit tricky. That's why Rockstar decided to tweak the system when they re-released LA Noire for Switch, PS4 and Xbox One in 2017. Now the three options available to you are Good Cop, Bad Cop and Accuse, which feel a lot more in line with the stuff Cole actually comes out with during his interrogations.
You left-wing leaning parasite. You expect me to sit here and listen to your drivel?
Right, like that. According to writer and director Brendan McNamara, the original options were coax, force, and lie, which is what they were working towards when the actor recorded the lines, which gives some context to Cole's sudden outbursts. Additionally, Cole is a hard-boiled 1950s detective, so being a simmering cauldron of rage is somewhat to be expected.
It's real funny, wise guy. You want to try saying that again with no teeth?
Zero chill, those guys.
What's up, everybody? I'm Akeem Lamonson, and in today, the next gen is almost the current gen. Haptic feedback to still unanswered, chewing out his Joker cinematographer, and then bailing on a scene completely. Yeah, that's the one. Well, even though he seemed kind of blindsided when Jimmy Kimmel played it during their interview last week, new details suggest that the outtake, get this, was faked. In an interview with Business Insider, Joker cinematographer Larry Sher, the guy on the other end of this particular outtake, said the whole thing was just a bit. Joaquin Phoenix is just doing his thing. Guys, come on. Chung, you just... And that was your...
This will change the world.
It's only just begun.
Do you know what I hold in my hand? Absolute power.
What's going on, everyone? Jeremy here from The Quartering, and Birds of Prey, the first trailer, has been released, the Harley Quinn story. And while it certainly is an excellent 2-minute ad for Hot Topic and Spencer's Gifts, I'm not really sure what to expect from the film. If it's more of an edgy kind of dark tale like we saw with Joker, I'd be very genuinely interested. Certainly Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn is excellent. It's probably what saved the film from a lot of early ridicule, at least from me, after looking at some of the moments in the trailer, like having Rosie Perez in there. I mean, I guess her ragtag bunch of buddies, but Margot Robbie does know how to play Harley Quinn. However, Ewan McGregor says Birds of Prey is a feminist film and will take a true look at misogyny. Damn. These.
What's up, everybody? I'm Damon Hatfield here with Tom Marks. Tom has a great piece on IGN.com today breaking down the amount that video game retailers take from the sale of each game. And this is all coming up because when the Epic Game Store launched last year, there's a lot of talk about how they're only taking 12% as compared to their number one retailer, Steam, taking 30%. But as it turns out, that 30% is pretty much what everyone else is taking. That's the industry standard, is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much right. A lot of people, when Epic came out with 12% and Valve, the 30% number was pretty widely known. People thought that was really high, and that's been the conversation since. And if you're in the industry, you probably already know this, but it actually turns out that 30% number is pretty much just what it is across the board. All the physical retailers do that. The app stores do that, like Google and Apple. It's just generally the norm. And I don't think that is the perception for most people who are just playing and buying games on the regular.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. So it's not just that Epic is undercutting Valve, instead Epic is undercutting pretty much everyone else.
Pretty much, they're undercutting physical retailers. On top of that, an important part of if you use the Unreal Engine and you're selling through the Epic Store, the 5% license fee for that, the royalties that usually go for the Unreal Engine, are waived on the Epic Store too. So if you're selling on Steam, then it's actually like another 5% you're saving through Epic if you're using Unreal. So there's a lot that they're doing that's like pretty significantly lower than anybody else.
Now, you spoke to multiple sources for the story. Were these sources actually developers, publishers?
It was kind of all around. We talked to some developers. We talked to some people on the publishing side. We talked to the retailers themselves. Like, we have a statement from Microsoft within the article. So yeah, we tried to get a pretty wide spread of like anybody in the industry who kind of had info on this stuff.
And one of your sources told you that there is currently tremendous pressure across the industry to lower the cut.
Yeah,
that stores take. What does that mean to you? They want stores to be taking less than 30% across the board?
Yeah, I think what it basically indicates, and that's not a direct quote, it's just kind of the sentiment they had. I think what this indicates is really that people want this to change. There's growing sentiment that 30% is too much, and people are seeing what the Epic is doing in a very real way. And not just Epic, they're not the only person who's gone below 30%, but people are seeing that and saying, hey, this should change. This is too high and this needs to go down. And that's, whether that's actually picking up steam, who knows, of like actually changing. Sorry, no pun intended.
I want the pun to be intended. The pun should always be intended.
I'm sorry. Well, whether that's actually getting the ball rolling on that or not is one thing, but people definitely, from what we've been told, want that number to be lower and want the standard to go down.
And like, the point of your piece wasn't to try and like heap praise on Epic, or to try and damn the other retailers that are charging 30%. It's just to sort of bring awareness to what most of these stores are taking for themselves.
Right. These are things that, once again, if you're in the industry, you know all this probably, but it's things that are very behind closed doors, very businessy.
For much more on everything.
It's Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Fear of drowning is one of the favorite tools of climate alarmists. I'm going to show you in this video how NASA creates fake sea level graphs, which are then fed into fake news sources like the Washington Post. Seas are now rising faster than they have in 2,800 years, scientists say. Anytime you see the word scientists say in a news article, you can pretty much assume that everything else you're going to read in the article is a bunch of nonsense. The body of scientists holds many different opinions, and any newspaper writer who doesn't respect that fact is simply not being honest. So down at the bottom of the page it says, seas rose about 14 centimeters, 5.5 inches from 1900 to 2000. The new study suggests for a rate of 1.4 millimeters per year. The current rate, according to NASA, is 3.4 millimeters per year, suggesting that sea level rise is still accelerating. So the study claims that sea level rise has more than tripled since the year 2000. I'm going to show you now how this fraud is accomplished. But first, let's look at some of the visual propaganda which this sort of nonsense enables. The weather of the future, Manhattan underwater. The exact same propaganda from 85 years ago. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world. And there it is, Manhattan underwater. So here's the NASA data which shows the tripling of sea level rise rates. It was actually generated by the fraudsters at the Australian CSIRO. In this graph, I annotate what they've done. From 1880 to 1940, it was 1.2 millimeters per year. From 1940 to 1990, it was 2 millimeters per year. In recent years, it's been 4 millimeters per year. So you can see how the graph is curving upwards. That indicates that sea level rise is accelerating. It sounds very convincing, except for the fact that in the 1990 IPCC report, they said there is no convincing evidence of an acceleration in global sea level rise during the 20th century. Now let's look at the NASA sea level graph from 1982. This was from a paper co-authored by NASA's James Hansen, the guy who a few years later started the global warming scare before Congress. But note how in the 1982 graph, instead of having an upwards curvature, it has a downwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise was decelerating or slowing down. In fact, the 1982 NASA graph showed essentially no sea level rise from 1950 through the mid-1970s. And here's the bottom of the 1982 paper. The sea level response to this warming should be carefully determined to aid our understanding of the processes and to allow early detection of any nonlinear response. So what he meant by a nonlinear response was a curvature. In the case of the 1982 graph, it was a downwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise was slowing down. But in the case of the current NASA graph, it's an upwards curvature, indicating that sea level rise is accelerating or speeding up. Now let's look at how the 1982 NASA graph compares with the current one. You can see that NASA's made huge changes since the year 1950. They used to show after 1950 sea level rise slowing down, and now they show it speeding up after 1950. Now let's look at how they accomplished this data tampering. This graph shows all 365 NOAA global sea level tide gauges. These straight lines in this graph are the trend lines. You can see that many stations show sea level falling and others show it rising. This doesn't make a lot of sense until you think about what tide gauges do. Tide gauges are not actually measuring changes in sea level. What they're measuring is changes in sea level relative to changes in the land elevation. If the land is rising at the location of the tide gauge, then sea level will appear to be falling. And if the land at the location of the tide gauge is falling, then sea level will appear to be rising. So this should give you a hint that you can create any trend you want by cherry picking the right stations. In order to demonstrate this, I created a test case. For this test case, I used 3 stations. This one in the Netherlands where sea level is rising very slowly and there's no upwards curvature. There's been no acceleration. And here's one from Italy which shows the same thing. Very slow sea level rise and no acceleration. And the third graph is from the Philippines. As you can see, something catastrophic happened in the 1960s. The tide gauge went from almost no sea level rise to extremely rapid sea level rise. I don't know what caused this, but this property makes it a good example for this test case. In this graph, I averaged all 3 stations together, and guess what we see? Just like in the 1982 NASA graph, sea level rise slowed down during the 1950s. But since the mid-1960s, the average of our 3 stations shows very rapid sea level rise. I measured the different trends on this graph. Prior to the mid-1960s, our average was about 0.18 millimeters per year, but since then it's about 0.54 millimeters per year. So I've demonstrated a tripling of sea level rise rates, just like NASA shows in their current graphs. And you can see the increase in rise rates very plainly as an upwards curvature in the graph. Or in this case, it was actually more like a break in slope than a smooth curvature. But for the sake of this experiment, it's the same idea. Obviously, what I did in this experiment was scientific nonsense, but I used the same technique which NASA and CSIRO did to create their upwards curvature. I doubt NASA and CSIRO used the same stations which I did, but the point is that by cherry-picking data, you can create any shape curve which you want. Now let's look at the correct way to measure changes in rate of sea level rise. Over large distances, the oceans appear flat because water seeks a level surface. This is exactly the reason why people used to believe the Earth is flat. And some people who are almost as clueless as climate alarmists still do. If a giant iceberg from East Antarctica slipped into the sea, like climate scientists are always trying to scare us about, then we would see a significant rise in sea level everywhere on Earth. All of the oceans are interconnected. This makes it very easy to detect changes in the rate of sea level rise. All you need are a handful of good stations, like the one at the Battery in New York and Lower Manhattan. This tide gauge has been active since the 1850s and shows a steady rate of sea level rise. It shows no upwards curvature, it shows no downwards curvature. In other words, it shows no change in the rate of sea level rise, just as the 1990 IPCC report said. Another good station to use would be the one from Key West, Florida, which also shows no change in the rate of sea level rise. I'm sure Greta would like us to use this one from Stockholm, which shows sea level falling. Sea level isn't actually falling at Stockholm, but the land is rising. But the key point here is that there's no curvature. There's no indication of a change of rate of sea level rise or fall. I'll show you a couple more good tide gauges with long-term records. Seattle and Alameda, California, in the San Francisco Bay. Neither shows any change in the rate of sea level rise. In order to detect a change in the rate of sea level rise, you would look for an upwards or downwards curvature, and it should be visible at every single station. You don't need hundreds of mediocre stations in order to detect changes in the rate of sea level rise. All you need are a handful of good ones. But if your intent is to try to fool people into believing that sea level rise is accelerating, then you cherry pick stations out of this group in order to create the trend that you want. There's no reason to believe that sea level rise is accelerating. And from history, we know that sea level used to rise much faster. Over the past 20,000 years, sea level has risen about 120 meters or 400 feet. From about 14,000 years ago until 8,000 years ago, sea level rose very fast as the great glaciers of the last ice age melted. But over the past 8,000 years, sea level has been rising very slowly. Climate alarmists want you to believe that this 400 feet of sea level rise was natural, but the last few millimeters were man-made. The ideas which climate alarmists are peddling are complete nonsense, but NASA has given them a huge boost by creating fake graphs for them. It would be interesting to find out who's paying NASA to create these fake graphs and why they're doing it. Barack Obama said that climate skeptics were members of the Flat Earth Society. But the reality is that climate alarmists are doing some of the worst and most fraudulent junk science in history. And their ideas about a climate crisis are no more credible than those of the Flat Earth Society. In 1988, climate alarmists predicted that the Maldives would be underwater within 30 years. Well, it's been 31 years and the Maldives are doing just fine. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, "Reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." And an increasing number of people are starting to understand that they are being fooled by fraudsters at government agencies. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I saw a great headline on Google News this evening. Here's why scientists are working so hard to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So I pictured a bunch of scientists in white lab coats sitting at Earth's control panel, frantically working to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius, wiping sweat off their brows, knowing that survival of the planet is dependent on them keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. But meanwhile, back in the real world, in 1986, NASA's James Hansen made his first appearance before Congress. Overheating of Earth poses survival threat. Scientists are warning Congress that the long-theorized, life-threatening overheating of the Earth from man-made air pollution is now a frightening reality. The fact that the greenhouse effect is real is proven, said James Hansen, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Hansen said the average U.S. temperature has risen from 1 to 2 degrees since 1958 and is predicted to increase an additional 3 or 4 degrees sometime between 2010 and 2020. And all of this is going to happen before the year 2020. So basically, we're looking at 4 to 6 degrees warming in the next 10 weeks. But let's look for a minute at Hansen's claim that the average U.S. temperature has risen 1 to 2 degrees since 1958. Remember that he gave this presentation to Congress in 1986. This is a graph Hansen published of U.S. temperatures in 1999. The left circle shows 1958, and the right circle shows 1986, when Hansen gave his testimony to Congress. Where did Hansen get 1 to 2 degrees warming out of that? It was about 0.1 C. He was off by nearly a factor of 10. And why did he cherry pick 1958 as his start year? Why didn't he start back here in the 1930s? Had he started here in the 1930s, he would have shown nearly half a degree Celsius cooling. Hansen was misrepresenting the past, and he was also misrepresenting the future. When the subsequent warming he predicted didn't happen, he simply changed the data. Shortly after the year 1999, NASA and NOAA changed the U.S. temperature data to create a long-term warming where previously it was a long-term cooling. They made a bunch of excuses for this data tampering and published them in peer-reviewed papers. Nixon called this plausible deniability. This data tampering was necessary to keep the public from learning that James Hansen had no idea what he was talking about. So they took the measured data in blue, they cooled the past and warmed the present to create a warming trend where there isn't any in the actual data. And this graph shows the adjustments that are being made. Temperatures before the year 2005 are cooled progressively more as you go backwards in time. And recent temperatures are being rapidly increased upwards. So scientists aren't working hard to limit warming, they're working hard to create it where it doesn't exist, because their funding depends on it. And the only control knob for temperature which these scientists have is their software, which creates the fake data. And how would scientists control the temperature anyway? They're just sitting in their office playing with computer models. They would be more productive playing Minecraft. And I wish these scientists would send some of their heat-trapping CO2 down here to Colorado, as we're facing record cold in a couple days. No, scientists aren't working hard to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius. What they're actually doing is working hard to make fake graphs to make it look like Earth is warming towards 2 degrees Celsius. Their funding and their prestige depends on it. The people creating these fake graphs are the same climate modelers who made the forecasts of doom originally. They have a conflict of interest. It's like having a little league team who also serve as the umpires and scorekeepers. I don't think anyone would put up with that. The difference, of course, being that there are actually some good players in Little League. Superstitious people have always wanted to believe that someone else controls the weather and climate. In the 16th century, thousands of witches were burned at the stake for cooking the weather. The Salem witch trials were likely a response to bad weather. But climate alarmists are much more sophisticated now. They know that Republicans cause bad weather, not witches. Fortunately, they have their scientists at the control panel working 24/7 to rescue them. Reality is that climate modelers are not working to keep temperatures down. They're doing everything they can to create the appearance of a lot of warming. They have no interest or motivation to end the climate crisis scam. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The weather has turned and it's time for climate alarmists to change their focus from heat waves to snow and cold. Almost 20 years ago, Dr. David Viner at the Climatic Research Unit in England announced that children just aren't going to know what snow is. Let's look at how he did with that forecast. Well, it's now October and we're getting record snow in many parts of the world. This is the 8th October in a row with above average snow cover in the Northern Hemisphere and the 16th year out of the last 20. Autumn snow cover has been increasing in the Northern Hemisphere for the past 50 years, with recent years being the snowiest on record. And a very similar story for winter snow cover. It's also been increasing for 50 years. I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is a hotbed for climate research. We have the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and NOAA. And there's huge amounts of other climate research going on at the University of Colorado and at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. The forecast for Thursday, October 10th is looking very interesting here. It will be the earliest date on record which Boulder failed to get above freezing. The previous record was October 11th, 2009. It will also be the second year in a row which we had record cold on October 10th. And we're expecting about 5 inches of snow. Since atmospheric CO2 levels hit 350 parts per million in 1988, October 10th temperatures in Boulder have declined more than 10 degrees. And it was also our shortest summer on record. I took this picture on the first day of summer in the mountains west of Boulder. It looked a lot more like Christmas than like the summer solstice. You would think that the climate scientists here in Boulder might take notice of what's going on outside their window, but they are rather too busy with their climate models to notice what's going on in the real world. Last month, Montana was hit with an unprecedented 4 feet of snow. I'm pretty sure that Dr. David Viner's forecast from 20 years ago was wrong. Now let's look at the long history of nonsense being spread by climate alarmists about winter and snow. Snow is the white elephant in the room. In 2006, the New York Times announced the endless summer. It's not that I don't like 60-degree days and eating fresh spinach right out of my garden in December, but the extended growing season is one of the signs of global warming. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic. A year later, the New York Times declared that it's now impossible to ski because there's no snow. In 2012, the New York Times again announced the endless summer. And in 2014, the New York Times announced the end of snow. In 2012, the Washington Post predicted cherry blossoms blooming in February and starting their bloom process in January. And this was Washington 3 years later on March 7th. Washington climate expert Andy Weiss told me it was probably the first time the Potomac was frozen in March since the 18th century. I took the dogs for a walk that day on frozen Chesapeake Bay. It's kind of cool to know that we were the first to do that in March since the 18th century. And last year, the first week of January was the coldest on record in the northeastern United States. So there probably weren't too many cherry trees starting their blooming process. I took this picture of the cherry trees in the frozen tidal basin on January 8th of last year. Since carbon dioxide hit 350 parts per million in 1988, the trend for peak bloom date in Washington, D.C. has gotten about 2 days later. Over the past 100 years, March temperatures in the states surrounding Washington, D.C. have declined slightly. March in recent years have been among the coldest on record. The warmest month of March in the Washington, D.C. area was 1921. And if you remember yesterday, I released a video about how NOAA has erased the heat of 1921. Two other very warm Marches were 1945 and 1946. 1946 was a very interesting year because they had an early bloom and the cherry trees bloomed again in November. March 15th, 1946, the cherry trees around the tidal basin are showing their first blooms, somewhat to the surprise of park officials who hadn't expected them for another week. And then again on November 1st, 1946, the capital's famed cherry trees popped forth surprise blooms and roses bloomed along the Potomac Friday after a record 2-day heat wave that saw mercury reach 84 degrees. Imagine the hysteria among climate alarmists if we had a year like 1946 again now. Climate alarmists aren't doing too well with their winter forecasts. 6 of the 10 largest snowstorms to hit New York City have occurred in the past decade. And in the middle of this, the New York Times announced the end of snow. But being wrong 100% of the time is not a problem for climate alarmists. They simply rewrite history. Here's an article from the BBC in 2016. Will snow become a thing of the past as the climate warms? New York and Washington, D.C. have just been smothered by another massive snowstorm, which seems strange when you remember that the world is getting hotter. And then at the bottom of the article, the BBC says, the real answer is rather surprising. Extreme snowfall is actually an expected consequence of a warmer world. So when they said children just aren't going to know what snow is, what they really meant was that extreme snowfall was going to become commonplace. In the 2001 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, they said, milder winter temperatures will decrease heavy snowstorms, which is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists are trying to say they predicted all along. And the New York Times has been intermittently doing this for decades. In 1996, they blamed global warming for the blizzard, which apparently is the same as no snow at the New York Times. But we all know that being a climate alarmist means never having to say you're sorry. In 2010, the New York Times said, bundle up, it's global warming. The overall warming of the atmosphere is actually creating cold weather extremes. That was right in between when they announced the endless summer in 2006 and in 2012. Whatever the current weather is, they say this is the trend and that they predicted it all along. Now let's look at one of my favorite topics, which is ski forecasts. In 2009, Alex Hill, the chief government advisor with the Met Office, told the Scotsman there was no future for skiing in Scotland because climate change would see winters become too warm for regular snowfall. And less than a year later, Scottish ski resorts had to shut down because they had too much snow. The organization Save Our Snow has on their front page, woman achieves 10 years of monthly Scottish skiing despite climate change. Last year, the New York Times announced that it was going to get too hot for the Winter Olympics. And on February 9th last year, Alternet said, Winter Olympics threatened by global warming, but NBC won't acknowledge it. That was one day after it was reported that the 2018 Winter Olympics opening ceremony could be the coldest ever. The 1932 Winter Olympics were held at Lake Placid, New York, and almost had to be canceled because they didn't have any snow a week before the Olympics started. New York City was having record heat during the weeks prior to the 1932 Winter Olympics. New York, January 15, 1932, with a high temperature of 66 degrees at 4 p.m. today, New York enjoyed the third successive day of record January warm weather. Well, things have changed at Lake Placid, and they've been having record snowfall in recent years. And the same story on the West Coast. The three snowiest years on record at Squaw Valley, California were 2011, 2017, and this past season. This is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists predicted. Los Angeles Times, June 2001. Less snowfall could spell big problems for California. New scientific research suggests that global warming, even by what experts consider conservative estimates, will severely shrink the Sierra snowpack. Top climate fraudster Catherine Hale from Texas Tech University said, if we continue our addiction to fossil fuels, 70 to 90% of the actual snow on the ground in the California Sierras could be gone by the end of this century. They were still skiing in California in August this year. Last year, the federal government was warning about dwindling Sierra snowpack in between the two record years of 2017 and 2019. Climate alarmists can't even get their history right. This is an article from 2006. 46 years ago this month, the world's athletes frolicked in the snow at the 1960 Winter Olympics in Squaw Valley, California. Actually, what happened at Squaw Valley in 1960 is that they almost had to cancel the Olympics because of a lack of snow. 9th of February 1960, change to snow saves California Olympic site. Squaw Valley, California, rain turned to snow just in time to avert possible disaster at the Winter Olympic Games. New England states were offering to take the Winter Olympics if they weren't able to ski in California. But things are much better at Squaw Valley now. Their three heaviest snow years all occurred in the past decade. Never mind that they've been wrong about everything in the past and that they switch their story every few months. The New York Times says the end is near and we only have 12 years left for the planet. If climate alarmists are worried about skiing, they can always ski in southern Arizona. I took this picture on New Year's Day. And a few weeks later, Arizona had another large snowstorm, which turned out to be the snowiest day on record in Arizona. Arizona had their longest ski season ever this year, with skiers at Flagstaff skiing until the middle of May. I took this picture at Los Alamos, New Mexico during Christmas week last year. The snow got deeper and deeper over the next few weeks and ended up being one of the snowiest months on record in New Mexico. And I took this picture of fresh snow in the mountains of New Mexico in June this year. Heavy snow like that in June in New Mexico is pretty unusual. So let's look at how climate alarmists responded to the record snow in Montana last month. Chuck Bell, the NBC meteorologist at Washington, D.C., said, one of the atmospheric response to radical heat in the east is record snow in the west. It's all part of our changing climate. So I spent about 30 seconds fact-checking Chuck, and I sent him this article. September 22nd, 1895, snow in the west, hot in the east. Snow in Dakota, Montana, and Colorado, different in the east. According to the official record, today was the hottest day of the year, with the thermometer touching 97 degrees in New York. Springfield, Massachusetts, September 21st, the thermometer registered 105 degrees here today. Brattleboro, Massachusetts, September 21st, 1895. This was the hottest day of the season. The thermometer reached 105 degrees. Rawlins, Wyoming. A heavy northeast snowstorm began early this morning. It's now 8 inches deep and still snowing. There are some fears for sheep still in the mountains. If it should turn cold, there will be heavy losses. Chuck Bell apparently believes that a similar weather pattern to 1895 is an indication that the climate has changed. Could you imagine what Chuck Bell would say if it had 105 degrees in Massachusetts on September 21st now? Climate alarmists are all over the map. They don't know the past, they don't know the present, they don't know the future. And when they're wrong, they're unable to admit it. There's no reason to take the New York Times or other climate alarmists seriously. We don't have any need for Monty Python's Flying Circus anymore because we have the New York Times, Washington Post, and Chuck Bell. And happy skiing in what looks like it could be another great winter. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Eller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Some guy named Malin Baker took it on himself to debunk me on YouTube. His video is very long, but I'm just going to show you the first segment.
Because nobody wants fraud going on. He starts by focusing on the National Climate Assessment for the US. Basically, it contained a bunch of graphs that seriously annoyed him. One of his arguments is that the data sequence for related graphs has been carefully selected to show the picture the dreadful alarmists want to show. Well, that's perfectly feasible. It's a well-known technique. In fact, Heller says it's a well-known technique used by the alarmists. However, as you'll know if you've seen the debate videos between him and Potholer54, linked below, it's a technique he's not always been averse to using himself. Anyway, let's hear the case for the prosecution from his latest video.
First, let's look at the heatwave graph, which starts in 1960. They carefully picked a period during the global cooling scare to start their graph so that they could show heat waves increasing over time. And here's the underlying data from the part of the National Climate Assessment which didn't go out to journalists and politicians. This graph is warm spells days, this one is heat wave magnitude, and this one is warmest temperature of the year. As you can see, summers were much hotter in the United States prior to 1960. So by hiding all the data before 1960, they were able to show a little bit of an upwards trend. I overlaid the part of the graph which went out to policymakers over here in this corner on top of the underlying data. You can see exactly what they did.
So here we're talking about heat waves, and he's correctly pointing out that the graph going back to the 1900s shows a much bigger spike before the period of the graph used in the climate change document. And if you took that spike out, you'd say it was pretty much flat. Maybe a bit of a push upwards right at the end, but too short a period to make a trend. It's worth noting what that spike actually is. It is, of course, the great dust bowl of the 1930s. If you glance at the scientific literature about that period, we still don't conclusively understand all of the factors that led to the awful conditions that blighted so many lives. But it's believed to have been made more intense by the poor farming methods that were being used at the time, which displaced deep-rooted grasses that would trap moisture. And that would explain why it hasn't happened since. But we certainly don't know conclusively whether that was the case. In any case, it seems pretty clear that it's something of an extraordinary anomaly. But even if you don't have that, you still end up with a fairly flat picture, which seems to support Heller's case. But this is just one of a number of related graphs. And this one uses a composite rating called a heat wave index, which is calculated, determined by what percentage of the country experienced how many heat waves. And like any composite figure, it's not always obvious exactly what story it's telling.
Mellon pulled a bait and switch. That's not the graph I was using in my video. That's a different one from the EPA. The graphs I was using were from the National Climate Assessment, but they were hidden in the final document. The URLs are written right at the bottom of the slide. The final document, which went out to policymakers, intentionally hid the underlying data from the National Climate Assessment. Mellon is trying to change the subject away from the fact that the people who put out the document intentionally hid their own data. But let's move on to the rest of his argument, where he says it was just a very narrow spike and was caused by farmers. It wasn't a narrow spike. Temperatures were elevated for 40 years. The Dust Bowl years were just a few years during the 1930s, but the heat started long before that. This graph shows the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations going back to the year 1900. You can see that the period from 1910 through the 1950s had a lot more hot days, long before the Dust Bowl started. Now let's look at Mellon's claim that farmers caused the Dust Bowl. There was a worldwide drought in 1934. This article from June 1934 was written by the chief meteorologist of the U.S. Weather Bureau. Worldwide drought is seen likely. Weatherman admits there's something wrong and that no one knows why. What is wrong with the world's weather is a question I've been asked many times in the last few weeks. Here's an article from Australia, June 4th, 1934. World drought, farmers' ruinous losses. almost universal disaster. Europe revives pagan rites. Here's one from England in 1934, drought in England. England has just experienced the worst drought for nearly 100 years. Here's another one from Australia, June 1934, worldwide drought. Drought in wheat-producing countries of 3 continents threatens a food shortage. This map shows the actual Dust Bowl area. It's a pretty small area centered around the Oklahoma Panhandle. So the farmers in this region caused a worldwide drought? That theory is complete nonsense. 80% of the United States was in drought. These farmers were victims of the drought. Bad farming practices may have aggravated the dust, but they didn't cause the drought. And they certainly didn't cause the unprecedented heat, which went all over the country. Mellon is talking complete gibberish. Here's an article from 1998. Records stored by nature in the bottoms of lakes and the growth rings of ancient trees show that in the late 1300s and again in the late 1500s, withering megadroughts lasting at least 25 years descended on western North America. Sand dunes rolled across much of the Great Plains and can be found beneath now fertile topsoil in some areas. And Sierra Nevada mountain lakes that today provide water for much of California dried up completely. The two scientists pointed out that droughts 400 and 600 years ago had nothing to do with human-induced global warming. Let's read this again. Sand dunes rolled across much of the Great Plains. Dust bowls happen. They're not caused by farmers. The bottom line is that summers were much hotter in the United States from the 1910s through the 1940s, and that the National Climate Assessment final document hid their own data. This black line is not somebody else's data. It is the underlying data from the National Climate Assessment, which is being hidden. And farmers in the Oklahoma Panhandle did not cause the worldwide drought. And carbon dioxide did not cause the mega droughts in the 1300s and the 1500s. Can we get back to doing science, please? And before I finish up, let's look at some more historical heat waves. The history of the world's droughts goes back to the year 627, when in France and Germany, thousands of human beings died of thirst. In the year 1000, the rivers of Europe dried up, and heaps of fish were left to putrefy and spread the plague that followed. In 1123, the Rhine River dried up in Alsace. During the Battle of Bella in 1260, more men died from heat than wounds. In 1303 and 1304, the Rhine, the Loire, and Seine rivers ran dry. In 1779, many persons in Bologna were stifled. Shops all over Europe were closed for months. In 1821, a plague of mice came with intolerable heat. More than 200,000 persons died from heat in France. Mellon seems like a nice enough guy. I'm going to ask him respectfully to quit spreading superstition and join me in spreading the truth. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The fact-checking website Snopes did a hit piece on me this week. It was centered around this animation, which I published on my previous website in 2012. The animation flashes between the 1999 NASA version of U.S. temperatures and the 2012 version. In 1999, NASA showed an 80-year-long cooling trend for the United States, with 1934 as the hottest. But in the 2012 version, they turned the 80-year trend into warming and made 1998 the hottest. Snopes did not mention me by name in the article, and instead of pointing to my website, they pointed to an archived version of it. They also did not contact me. Apparently, they're very afraid of giving me publicity, and they're not good enough journalists to actually contact me to get my opinion. So let's see what they said in their hit piece. All told, the most significant effect of all these changes came from the time of day adjustments. Collectively, the adjustments served to produce a slightly increased warming trend in the United States record compared to the earlier records. And they got this information from Zeke Housefather at Berkeley Earth. But the 1999 paper from NASA where the graph was published had a completely different story. James Hansen, the lead author, said, in the U.S., there has been little temperature change in the past 50 years, the time of rapidly increasing greenhouse gases. In fact, there was a slight cooling trend throughout much of the country. Now let's look at the Snopes claim again. They claim that all the adjustments did was make a slightly increased warming trend. But the author of the 1999 paper said there was a slight cooling trend throughout much of the country. Snopes has already discredited themselves, but it gets much worse. These are the actual measured and adjusted trends for NOAA United States Historical Climatology Network data. The blue line is the measured data, and the red line is the adjusted data. I calculated these from data taken directly from the NOAA website using software which I've released to the public as open source years ago. As you can see, it's not a small difference in trend. The measured temperature data shows the 1930s as being the hottest decade in the United States. But the adjusted data shows the 1930s much cooler than recent decades. This is a huge change, not a minor change, as Snopes claims. These heat wave graphs are taken from the most recent National Climate Assessment, and they show that heat waves during the 1930s were much hotter than any recent heat waves. This tells us that summers were much hotter during the 1930s than any recent summers. So when NOAA cools the 1930s like this with their adjusted data, that should set off some alarm bells. This text was in the 1999 NASA paper, which I generated the animation showing the changes from. James Hansen said, empirical evidence does not lend much support to the notion that climate is headed precipitately toward more extreme heat and drought. The drought of 1999 covered a smaller area than the 1988 drought, when the Mississippi River almost dried up. In 1988 was a temporary inconvenience as compared with repeated droughts during the 1930s Dust Bowl that caused an exodus from the prairies, as chronicled in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. So NOAA and NASA are erasing an important part of U.S. history when they make the heat of the 1930s disappear in their adjusted data. Now let's look at this claim from Snopes again. All told, the most significant effect of all these changes came from the time of day adjustments. So I took the NOAA data and generated this graph. The blue line is the time of day adjustments, and the red line is the total adjustments. The time of day adjustments are about 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit total, but the total adjustments are about 3 times that large. The total final adjustments are more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And particularly interesting has been since the year 2005, the total adjustments have been very large, whereas the time of day adjustments are very small, and they're actually in the opposite direction. This shows us once again that the Snopes claim is incorrect. I sent this graph over to Zeke Housefather at Berkeley Earth and to Snopes, and Zeke responded with, well, you just don't know how to do the math. Once again, my code is open source. It's very simple. Hundreds of people have looked at it, and no one's ever found anything wrong with it. But Zeke's argument is difficult to deal with because Snopes isn't going to go off and try to do the math themselves. So here's where the smoking gun comes in. I figured out a way to prove that the adjustments are wrong without doing any calculations. We're going to zoom in on Texas now. Texas is one of the most heavily tampered states by NOAA. The measured Texas temperature data since 1895 shows cooling, but the adjusted data shows warming. And the measured data shows 1921 as being the hottest year, whereas the adjusted data shows it not particularly hot. So what we're going to do now is focus on Southwest Texas temperature data from the summer of 1921. Texas' longest heat wave occurred during the summer of 1921, when Encino had 157 consecutive days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit from May 8th to October 11th. That's a lot of heat for NOAA to erase. Once again, this is the measured Texas temperature data, with 1921 as the hottest and a strong cooling trend. And this is the adjusted data with a strong warming trend, and the heat of 1921 largely diminished. Now let's compare that to the NOAA graph from 2012, which was captured by Anthony Watts. In NOAA's 2012 version of the graph, there was no warming in Texas, and 1921 was still the hottest year. And Anthony Watts also captured this article from the San Antonio Express News dated April 23, 2012. Research shows Texas is not warming. Once again, there's no warming trend, and 1921 was the hottest year. So this data tampering in the current NOAA graph has occurred since the year 2012. Now is where I'm going to show you this smoking gun. All of the data on this graph is taken directly from the NOAA data sets. There's no calculation being done on my part. The yellow line is the daily maximum temperature data for Encino, Texas for July 1921. The white line is the unadjusted monthly average temperature taken directly from NOAA. The blue line is the time of observation bias adjusted monthly temperature taken directly from NOAA. And the green line is the final adjusted average temperature, again taken directly from NOAA. During July 1921, the name of the station operator at Encino, Texas was J. Guerrero. He took his observations that month at 7 o'clock in the morning. This tended to make his measured temperatures a little bit too cool, so NOAA adjusted the time of observation bias adjustments a little bit upwards. You can see that the blue line is 1/10 of a degree higher than the white line, which was the measured temperatures. But here's where the problem shows up. Look at the final adjusted temperature. It's almost 5 degrees cooler than the raw or time of observation bias adjusted temperatures. And incredibly, it's cooler than all but 2 of the days during the month. What kind of average is this? The only way this could happen legitimately is if NOAA thought there was something seriously wrong with the thermometer at Encino, Texas, and that it was reading almost 5 degrees too high. In that case, they would have homogenized in temperatures from these surrounding stations. So let's take a look at those stations. Encino had 3 neighbors which reported the full month of July 1921. They were Eagle Pass, Alice, and Falfurrias. Now we're going to look at the adjustments at all 3 of those stations. This is Falfurrias. Just like at Encino, they've made a huge downwards adjustment in the final temperature data. And once again, it's cooler than all but 2 of the days during the month. And once again, I'm going to remind you that these are not calculated data. These numbers were taken directly off the NOAA website. It's already pretty obvious that the final adjusted temperatures are fake. But let's look at Encino's other 2 neighbors. This is Eagle Pass. Again, we see the same problem. The final adjusted temperatures are way too low. They make no sense. And at the third and final neighbor, Alice, Texas, we see exactly the same thing. The final adjusted temperature is completely nonsensical. So the only 2 possibilities for legitimate temperature adjustments are time of observation bias, which obviously isn't what's going on here, or homogenization, which also doesn't work. Put quite simply, NOAA is committing massive temperature fraud. There's no 2 ways about it. And if these adjustments are actually peer-reviewed as Snopes claimed, that would indicate a much broader problem in climate science. Here's the total current adjustments for Texas being made by NOAA. NOAA cooled Texas' hottest year, 1921, by 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's how they made Texas' hottest year disappear and turned a strong cooling trend into a strong warming trend. This is not science, it's fraud, and they're erasing America's important history. There is no way to get around the fact that these adjustments are fraudulent. And there's also no way to get around the fact that Snopes is not a legitimate news source. They failed to contact me, they didn't do any good research, and they printed a bunch of garbage. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This is a very short clarification video. Viewers had questions about a couple of my recent videos, and I'm going to briefly address them here. I included this diagram in my Greta Makes the Planet Hot as Venus video. The diagram shows that Earth's troposphere cools 10 degrees Celsius with each kilometer gain in elevation. And I made the point that it doesn't matter how much water vapor there is in the atmosphere as long as the humidity is below 100%. This is important because water vapor is the primary greenhouse gas on Earth. And it tells us that the lapse rate in the atmosphere is independent of the amount of greenhouse gas. The confusion comes in with the term dry adiabatic lapse rate. There's a different lapse rate which is smaller for saturated air. It is frequently called the wet adiabatic lapse rate. It is different from the dry adiabatic rate because of the latent heat of water evaporating and condensing. And the terminology is confusing because most people associate dry air as meaning low humidity. But in the context of the lapse rate, even 99% humidity is considered dry. It's unfortunate that the people who chose the terminology used the terms wet and dry rather than saturated and unsaturated. But the key point is that the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere has no impact on the dry adiabatic lapse rate, other than a minor effect of different molecular weights, which is not important in Earth's atmosphere because CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. On Venus, the lapse rate is a little bit higher because CO2 has a higher molecular weight than either nitrogen or oxygen. This causes a larger pressure increase on Venus across 1 kilometer of the atmosphere. This is fairly technical, and I expect there will be more questions raised by what I just said. The other slide which caused confusion is this one from the World Starts in 1960 video. People couldn't understand why it was a problem that Zeke started his temperature trend at the low point in sea ice. The reason is because it was warm prior to 1960. That's why sea ice was declining, because the air temperature was warm. But after 1960, it got cold and sea ice expanded very rapidly. So what Zeke from Berkeley Earth did was he cut off all the warm years prior to 1960 and started right at the beginning of the cold years. Remember, in that video, I was discussing temperature trends, not sea ice trends. I was just using sea ice extent as a proxy for temperature. Hopefully this helped a few people and didn't put everyone else to sleep. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, Greta is going to do a very simple experiment which is going to make Earth as hot as Venus. This is Greta. She's standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. She's a very distant relative of Greta Thunberg, just like we all are. Greta is going to make Earth just as hot as Venus using only a shovel. This Greta attends school, and she has a science fair project to do. If you've ever hiked down the Grand Canyon, you know it's a lot hotter at the bottom than it is at the top. I've hiked down the Grand Canyon when there was snow at the top and was over 90 degrees at the bottom. This is from the Grand Canyon Lodge's website. If you plan to hike into the canyon below the rim, be prepared for much warmer conditions. In fact, summer temperatures along the Colorado River at the canyon bottom can reach as high as 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 C. Long sleeves and pants are advised to prevent dehydration and sunburn. And be sure to carry lots of water. While you're hiking, you'll want to drink plenty of water and sport drinks, and snack on salty, high-carbohydrate foods. The great depth of Grand Canyon produces a variety of conditions between the South Rim and Phantom Ranch. Temperatures usually vary by 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 C, between the top and the bottom. When I was working as a wilderness ranger in New Mexico 35 years ago, my boss was a former park ranger from the Grand Canyon. He had some pretty horrific stories about people who didn't bring water with them. But don't worry, I'm not going to share those with you today. So why is it hotter at the bottom of the Grand Canyon than it is at the top? This is a property which is true in all planets' tropospheres. If you go down in elevation, it gets hotter. If you go up in elevation, it gets cooler. On Earth, the rule is about 10 degrees Celsius for every 1,000 meters. The elevation of the bottom of the Grand Canyon is more than 1,000 meters below the top, thus resulting in the huge temperature difference. But Greta's got a problem. She can only hike down so far, and then she hits the bottom of the Grand Canyon and she can't get any hotter. That's why she's bringing the shovel with her. She's going to dig a very deep hole when she gets down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Temperatures on the surface of Venus are about 500 degrees centigrade. So using our rule for Earth's atmosphere, that means she's going to have to dig a hole which is 50 kilometers deep. But when she finishes digging later this afternoon, it will be 500 degrees Celsius at the bottom of her hole. She might run into a few logistical problems on her way down, but we're going to ignore those for this experiment. And anyone who nitpicks about those details will fail the course. Her science experiment is very basic atmospheric physics. As you go down 1 kilometer, the temperature of the atmosphere increases about 10 degrees Celsius. The only reason why the surface of the Earth is not hot like Venus is because our atmosphere is much thinner than the atmosphere of Venus. The hottest places on Earth are places like Death Valley, the Salton Sea, and the Dead Sea, which are below sea level. The reason why Death Valley is so hot is because there's more air above Death Valley than there is where I live in Boulder, Colorado, where it's much cooler. And if I go up into the mountains, it gets even cooler. If I go up 1 kilometer, the temperature drops about 10 degrees Celsius. It doesn't make any difference what the composition of the atmosphere is or how much greenhouse gas there is in the atmosphere that day. The amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere above you varies tremendously from day to day. Water is far and away the dominant greenhouse gas in Earth's atmosphere. So on a day when the humidity in the air is 50%, there's almost 5 times as much greenhouse gas in the air above you as on a day when the humidity is 10%. Yet it doesn't affect the lapse rate. On a humid day, it's 10 degrees Celsius per kilometer, and it's exactly the same on a dry day. This rule holds true until the humidity gets up to 100%, which is a case we're not testing in this experiment. The composition of the atmosphere and the amount of greenhouse gases has very little to do with why the atmosphere warms up as you go down in elevation. Greta's experiment was successful. She made Earth as hot as Venus using only a shovel. Carl Sagan started the idea of a runaway greenhouse effect on Venus. But it really had very little to do with the greenhouse effect. It had much more to do with the thickness of Venus's atmosphere. If Earth's atmosphere was just as thick as Venus, Earth would be almost as hot as Venus is. Greta just proved that with her shovel. The great American physicist and Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, "It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with the experiment, it's wrong." Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. 1921 was one of the most extreme years on record in the United States. In this video, I'm going to show you how NOAA has tried to make 1921 disappear. This article was in the New York Times this week in 1921. The article said that Earth had a fever, the same words which Al Gore used in his movie. New York Times, Monday, October 3rd, 1921. Freak weather laid to earthly mumps. Fever clings with abnormal heat. New record for 50 years. Many disasters of recent months ascribed to high temperatures and lack of moisture. The old spheroid known as Earth is emerging from a severe attack of meteorological mumps. It has been accompanied by an intermittent fever manifested in a worldwide heat wave of unusual length and intensity. In spite of crises and relapses, earthquakes, tidal waves, cloudbursts, typhoons, waterspouts, hailstorms, floods, and hurricanes in many widely separated parts, doctors are confident the patient will recover. Earth was experiencing a climate crisis in 1921, but the attitude of the New York Times was very different. In 1921, the New York Times was confident the Earth would recover, whereas in 2019, they say it's time to panic. The big difference being that 1921 actually was an extreme weather year. This year has been relatively mild by comparison. Let's take a closer look at 1921. Mansfield News, September 21st, 1921. Repeatedly during the past summer, the front pages of the papers have been filled with the news of flood disasters. Hundreds of lives have been lost and millions of dollars worth of property destroyed. On June 6, 1921, there were massive floods on the Arkansas River in Colorado and Kansas, and on the Pecos River in New Mexico and Texas. A river gone mad spreads terror and great destruction. Colorado flood sweeps over plains of Kansas. Pueblo in constant danger as floods sweep through city. The flooding in Pueblo, Colorado in June 1921 was one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history. 1,500 people lost their lives. The floodwater was 15 feet deep. Here's some pictures of downtown Pueblo, Colorado during the 1921 flood. Quite a mess. Pueblo is not that large a city, and losing 1,500 people was quite a disaster. Afternoon temperatures in 1921 were second highest on record in the United States after 1934. This is the actual thermometer data, not the tampered data you'll see in NOAA graphs. 1921 didn't have the extreme heat of years like 1934 and 1936, but it had very persistent heat. This is the graph of the percent of days above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. 1921 was the fourth highest on record after 1939, 1934, and 1936. However, if we look at the percent of days over 90 degrees, 1921 barely made the top 10. What set 1921 apart was not so much the extreme heat, but rather the persistent heat. A lot of the rest of this video is going to focus on Texas. 1921 was the hottest year on record in Texas. Once again, not so much because of extreme heat, but more because of persistent heat. Encino, Texas had an incredible 157 consecutive days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit from May 8th to October 11th, 1921. This was the Texas record. And during September 1921, Beaufort, South Carolina was over 90 degrees every single day. That's a record for September in South Carolina. Let's go back and look at the Texas temperature graph again. 1921 was the hottest, and there's been a sharp cooling trend. Now let's look at the adjusted temperature data from NOAA. They completely made 1921 disappear, and now Texas is warming sharply. NOAA made the 157 consecutive days over 90 degrees in Texas in 1921 simply disappear, erased from history by government bureaucrats with an agenda. George Orwell said, "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." This graph shows in blue the actual Texas temperatures, and in red the fake temperatures being reported by NOAA. NOAA turns a cooling trend into a warming trend by tampering with the data. This graph shows the data tampering which is being done. You can see how NOAA is massively cooling the past in Texas by more than 2 degrees. That's how they create a warming trend out of a cooling trend, by simply altering the data. In 2012, the San Antonio Express published this graph. The data was taken from the National Climatic Data Center at NOAA, and the headline said, "Research shows Texas is not warming." This was after the extremely hot summer of 2011 in Texas, and notice that NOAA still showed 1921 as the warmest year. And here's a graph which Anthony Watts directly captured from the NOAA website in 2012. It showed 1921 as the hottest year in Texas and essentially no warming trend. Now compare that to their current graph. They made 1921 disappear, and now they have a very strong warming trend. So we can see that most of the data tampering by NOAA occurred since the year 2012. During the very hot summer of 2011, ambulance-chasing Texas academics took full advantage of the heat. Andrew Dessler from Texas A&M University published this article in the Houston Chronicle. July 10th, 2011, as you sit by the pool and sweat this summer, one book you should be reading is The Impact of Global Warming on Texas. This book, written by a group of Texas academics, is a sober analysis of our state's vulnerability to climate change and the things we can do about it. It's a particularly appropriate read as we suffer through the hellish summer of 2011. While it is unknown exactly how much human activities are contributing to the summer's unpleasant weather, one lesson from the book is clear. Get used to it. The weather of the 21st century will be very much like the hot and dry weather of 2011. Giving extra credibility to this forecast is the fact that the weather extremes that we are presently experiencing were predicted in the first edition in 1995. Well, I'm a Texas academic, and I don't remember them consulting me. I got my master's degree at Rice University. Rice is called the Harvard of the South. I probably would have told them something a little bit different. Now let's look at how these academics did. This graph is the percent of days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit at all Texas U.S. Historical Climatology Network stations. And this is when Dessler wrote the article. It was really hot in Texas during the summer of 2011. But the trend is downwards, and since 2011, summers in Texas have been relatively cool. So Dessler did the standard climate alarmist trick. He cherry-picked 1 year and ignored the trend. And NOAA did their standard trick. They made the heat of 1921 disappear, they cooled the past, and destroyed America's history. But the 1,500 people who died in the flood in 1921 are very real, and NOAA can't make them disappear. And the record heat wave in Texas in 1921 was also very real. NOAA can't make that disappear. Ayn Rand said, "The hardest thing to explain is the glaringly evident which everybody had decided not to see." That's exactly what's going on with the imaginary climate crisis. All that we're seeing is the same weather which we've always had. But by tampering with the data, NOAA enables this sort of insanity by the New York Times. We need to put an end to this and flesh out the lunatics and criminals in government and the press who are perpetrating this scam. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Young Earth creationists believe that Earth is several thousand years old, but some climate scientists seem to believe that Earth's history began about 60 years ago. Zeke Hausfather from Berkeley Earth made this tweet discussing changes in Earth's temperature since the year 1960. The map shows a planet on fire. You can practically see the flames shooting up out of the Arctic. Zeke said the world as a whole has warmed by 0.9 C just since 1960, with some parts of the Arctic warming by more than 4 C. Here's a map of warming between January 1960 and August 2019. Note the very detailed contouring in this map, even in places like Antarctica where they only have a small handful of stations. That's a dead giveaway that the map is fake. They're showing precision much greater than their accuracy. No serious scientist would do something like that. Let's look at the details now. Berkeley Earth shows Antarctica warming significantly. This is very different from a study from NASA made by Gavin Schmidt. In 2004, Gavin Schmidt wrote, "While most of the Earth warmed rapidly during recent decades, surface temperatures decreased significantly over most of Antarctica." And NASA published this map shortly thereafter, showing in blue the cooling which had occurred over most of Antarctica. If we assume that the NASA map is correct, which shows cooling for several decades prior to 2005, then the only way the Berkeley Earth map could be correct would be if Antarctica had warmed a lot since the year 2005. Let's take a look at that. This is satellite data for the South Polar region going back to 1979. There has been little or no warming in Antarctica, particularly since the year 2005. So how did Berkeley Earth determine that Antarctica is warming when neither NASA nor satellite data shows any such thing? We're seeing a lot of indicators that the Antarctic data in the Berkeley Earth map is meaningless. In 1976, National Geographic published these satellite photos of Antarctic sea ice. This is summer sea ice on the left and winter sea ice on the right. As you can see, there was almost no sea ice left around Antarctica in January 1976. Just a tiny little bit of ice left fringing the edges of the continent. I don't see any reason to believe that the Berkeley Earth trends for Antarctica are correct. Based on the increase in Antarctic sea ice since the 1970s, it appears that the NASA map showing cooling is much more credible. So how did Zeke cherry-pick the year 1960 to start his trend? Well, in 1961, the New York Times reported that there was a unanimous consensus among scientists that Earth was cooling. And as I discussed in my previous video, if you want to show an upwards trend, you start at a very cold year. It's not science, but that's how you do propaganda. So let's look at the 1974 temperature graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Zeke started his temperature trend in 1960, right near one of the coldest points of the last century. Like I said, it's not science, but if you're trying to do propaganda, starting your trend at a low point is an excellent way to do it. By 1970, the United States and Soviet Union were pondering a new ice age. New York Times, July 18, 1970. U.S. and Soviet press studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. That does not sound like a planet on fire. But our top scientists had a plan to save us from global cooling. They were going to sprinkle coal dust on the ice pack in order to melt it and warm the Earth up. On March 2nd, 1975, the front page of the Chicago Tribune said, "Brr, new ice age on way soon." In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snow cap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Once again, that does not sound like a planet heating out of control. Now let's look at U.S. temperatures, which Zeke shows rapidly warming since the year 1960. Here's a graph of average mean temperatures for the United States for every year going back to the year 1900. I marked where Zeke's start point is, very close to the low point on the graph once again. Temperatures prior to 1960 declined sharply, but temperatures since 1960 have warmed. So once again, if you're a propagandist trying to show warming, you find a low point and start your graph from that point to show a warming trend. The untampered temperature trend for the United States over the past century is downwards. If we look at afternoon temperatures in the United States, we can see that they have declined sharply over the past century. Zeke's map shows the United States warming rapidly, but the actual data shows no such thing. Next, let's look at the Arctic. In 1939, it was reported, scientists have confirmed the fact that the Arctic regions around Spitsbergen are warming up at a rate of approximately 1 degree every 2 years. Since 1910, when observations first started in those regions, the cumulative rise of winter temperature has amounted to nearly 16 degrees. So from 1910 to 1939, the Arctic was warming very quickly. And that period of Arctic warming is reflected in the sea ice graph published by the Department of Energy in 1985. Sea ice diminished sharply from the year 1925 until the year 1960, which guess what? That's when Zeke starts his trend. How surprising that Zeke would start his trend right at the low point for Arctic sea ice. Every direction from the low point is up, whether you go forwards in time or backwards in time. Let's look at an article now from the year 1954, which was the second lowest point on record. In 1954, it was reported that the average temperature of the inhabited parts of the Earth had risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit within the past 100 years, and that winter temperatures at Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic had risen about 19 degrees Fahrenheit or 11 degrees Celsius since the year 1910. That's a lot more than the 4 degrees warming in the Arctic, which Zeke has reported since the year 1960. And what were scientists blaming it on in the year 1954? Well, carbon dioxide, of course. So in 1954, Earth had been warming very rapidly since the year 1910, but by 1961, there was unanimous consensus that Earth was cooling. So something drastic happened between 1954 and 1961. The Arctic went from rapid warming to rapid cooling, and obviously it wasn't due to carbon dioxide. It had to be something else. Here's the NASA graph of temperatures in the capital of Iceland from back in the days before they started tampering with the data. You can see that there was rapid warming until the 1940s, and then rapid cooling until the year 1979, and then rapid warming again. There's no correlation with carbon dioxide, but there's very close correlation with ocean circulation patterns. This graph shows in red the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and you can see a very close correlation between that and temperatures in Iceland. So there's no valid reason to try to force-fit a carbon dioxide theory of warming when ocean circulation patterns can explain it quite adequately. At least no reason unless your funding depends on force-fitting a carbon dioxide theory. Let's look now at a few more news articles about this period of warming. 1947, melting ice cap danger, warmer Arctic temperatures. If the Antarctic ice regions in the major Greenland ice cap should reduce at the same rate as they are at present melting, oceanic surfaces would rise to catastrophic proportions, and people living in the lowlands along the shores would be inundated. Wow, does that sound familiar? Dr. Allman added that temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. Now let's compare that to the 1975 Chicago Tribune article. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. So obviously the Arctic cooled a lot between 1947 and 1975. And that was during a time when carbon dioxide was rapidly increasing in the atmosphere. It's pretty obvious that CO2 does not control the climate. Here's another article from 1955, Melting Arctic Ice Warming Up World. There are now 6 million square miles of ice in the Arctic. There was once 12 million square miles. Another thing, almost every glacier, with one exception, has retreated, going back into the hills, is smaller than it was. So the extent of Arctic sea ice had declined by 50% by the year 1955. No wonder they're hiding the data before 1960. And here's a story from 1922. The Arctic Ocean is warming up. Icebergs are growing scarce, and in some places, the seals are finding the waters too hot. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers, he declared, all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of temperatures in the Arctic. At many points, well-known glaciers have entirely disappeared. While carbon dioxide levels are very low in 1922, this pretty much destroys the belief system of people who are trying to blame Arctic melting on carbon dioxide. The idea that carbon dioxide causes Arctic melting is completely unsupportable from a scientific point of view. In fact, the Arctic was ice-free 6,000 to 7,000 years ago when carbon dioxide levels were very low. In 1939, all of the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting, and it may without exaggeration be said that those glaciers, like those in Norway, faced the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. And 30 years later, after carbon dioxide levels had increased, the New York Times was talking about a new ice age. It's pretty clear now why the data is being hidden before 1960. This ClimateGate email shows us that climate scientists were aware of and were troubled by the warmth of the 1940s. So they discussed ways to make the 1940s warmth disappear. This is a letter from Tom Wigley at NCAR to Phil Jones at the Climatic Research Unit in England. If we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we would still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So they made a decision to get rid of the 1940s warmth, and they didn't even have an explanation for why they were doing it. This is not science, it's propaganda and fraud. And they did exactly that. This is the 1974 NCAR graph in black and the current NASA graph in red. They completely got rid of the cooling after 1940. Let's review the cherry picking again. Zeke started his trend at a low point in 1960. He also started his trend near a low point in U.S. temperatures. He started his trend right at the low point in sea ice. So someone on Twitter asked Zeke why he started in 1960. Zeke responded with, because I made the underlying data set for National Geographic, who have a map of warming since 1960 they want updated. You could go further back, but you start having gaps prior to the mid-1950s since we don't have any measurements in Antarctica before that point. Fair enough, except for the fact that his Antarctic data after 1960 was also fake. So why does National Geographic want to start in 1960? Well, that's easy to explain. This graph is from the November 1976 issue of National Geographic. It shows the tremendous warmth of the 1930s and 1940s, which National Geographic doesn't want anyone to remember. So they're simply hiding the high temperatures prior to 1960. The key principles of climate alarmism are cherry picking, data tampering, and hiding critical data. We are witnessing the biggest scam in science history. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Climate alarmists are quite literally taking us back to the Dark Ages. George Orwell said, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those that speak it." A vice president at the University of Alberta was just fired for telling the truth about carbon dioxide. The vice president of university relations at the University of Alberta has stepped down from her position amidst backlash over a billboard promoting potential benefits of climate change. The billboard, located on 178th Street in the West End, read, "Beefier barley," with subheading saying, "Climate change will boost Alberta's barley yield with less water feeding more cattle." Scientifically, there's nothing in the least controversial about what the billboard said. NASA recently released a study showing how much Earth has greened due to carbon dioxide fertilization. From a quarter to half of Earth's vegetated lands has shown significant greening over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide, according to a new study published in the journal Nature Climate Change on April 25th. An international team of 32 authors from 24 institutions in 8 countries led the effort, which involved using satellite data from NASA's Moderate Resolution Imaging Spectrometer. Corn yields have increased by 500% since CO2 was at 310 parts per million. What that billboard said was absolutely correct, and she lost her job for being a heretic to the climate religion. David Legates was the Delaware state climatologist, and he lost his job for similar reasons. He wrote this in an email to me. About a decade or more ago, I was told by someone that I had been placed on a federal do not fund list. Undaunted, I applied for a grant from NASA. Well, the proposal was rejected, but the letter back from NASA contained only a single review sheet that was blank except for the following note written in the comments section. The National Climatic Data Center should be funded to do this research. When I contacted the program officer, Jared Enton, he indicated that he was on vacation but would investigate right away. I've called and emailed. I've yet to hear back from him. Several years later, I applied to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to leverage weather radar to enhance agricultural forecasting. My proposal was submitted electronically and was listed as under review. In due course, I received a note from the USDA that all proposals had either been rejected or accepted, and they thanked me for my submission. Since I had not heard from them, I went online and checked my proposal. It was listed as under review. I sent an email to the program officer, and one of his assistants responded. She seemed so friendly and helpful and wanted to know more about the proposal that I had submitted. When I gave her the proposal ID number, I received a terse reply. "You'll have to take this up with the program officer." So I did. We played the same game again. He then stopped answering emails or phone calls. Eventually, I got the university research office to inquire. They said they were told by the program officer that we cannot be responsible for system problems. I've submitted a total of 5 federal grants since I was told. All 5 have met the same fate. No bad reviews, no reviews at all, and the program officer cuts off all communications. In the 1980s, John Darcy was convicted of fraud. He had made up data and nearly 50 papers were rejected. His penalty, he was forbidden from getting grants from the NIH for 10 years. I've been convicted of nothing. Indeed, I've been charged with nothing, but I've been blacklisted. This is how the climate orthodoxy purges heretics. Similarly, the Oregon state climatologist was fired for telling the truth about snow in the Cascade Mountains. He butted heads with the alarmist mayor of Seattle. Roger Pilkey Jr. from the University of Colorado was investigated by congressional Democrats for telling the truth about extreme weather frequency. There was never any basis to the investigation, and he was forced out of climate science for several years. I heard him speak about this last week at the University of Colorado. Chemistry professor Nicholas Trapella of Oregon State University was fired because he was a climate skeptic. OSU is a hotbed of climate change advocacy. Carrie Norgard, another professor at OSU, equates climate change skepticism with racism and believes it should be treated as a sickness or a mental illness. This is exactly the same way which the Soviet Union dealt with dissenters. My good friend Dr. Bill Gray at Colorado State University was the world's leading tropical meteorologist and the man who invented modern hurricane forecasting. Bill was a giant of a man in every way. In 1993, Dr. Gray was invited to a climate conference being held by new Vice President Al Gore. Bill told the Vice President that he would be happy to attend, but he's not a big fan of Gore's theories about global warming. After decades of getting funding from NOAA every year for his outstanding research, Bill never got another penny out of the government. I spoke about this last year with one of NOAA's top tropical meteorologists. He agreed with me that Bill had been mistreated by his colleagues and said, well, he threatened their funding, you know. And that's a key point. Having a climate skeptic in your midst threatens funding for the entire department. So Bill was ostracized by the department at Colorado State University. I would walk the halls with Dr. Gray at CSU's Atmospheric Sciences Department, and many people wouldn't even make eye contact with him. Bill was an extremely friendly and an extremely likable person, but he was a heretic and he threatened their funding. On his deathbed, Bill asked me to carry on his climate legacy, and that's a lot of the reason why I'm doing this. Peter Ridd from James Cook University was fired for telling the truth about the Great Barrier Reef. He was supposed to say that climate change was destroying the Great Barrier Reef, but it isn't true. And Dr. Ridd was recently awarded $1.2 million by the court for his unfair dismissal. The Alabama state climatologist, Dr. John Christie, actually had his office fired at by Earth Day protesters. His coworker, Dr. Roy Spencer, said, when some people cannot argue facts, they resort to violence to get their way. He said, maybe the March for Science should have been called the March to Silence. President Obama's Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, directly threatened climate skeptics in the Department of the Interior. She said, I hope there are no climate change deniers in the Department of the Interior. She knows nothing about science, but she told anyone who does that they better keep their mouth closed. President Obama, who also knows nothing about science, compared climate skeptics to the Flat Earth Society. One of these flat earthers was Nobel laureate in physics, Dr. Ivar Giaever. Dr. Giaever had supported Obama in the election. Giaever said, basically global warming is a non-problem. He ridiculed Obama for stating that no challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change. I say this to Obama, excuse me, Mr. President, but you're wrong, dead wrong. Giaever said, global warming really has become a new religion because you cannot discuss it. It's not proper. It's like the Catholic Church. The people behind the climate crisis scam are taking us back to the days of Galileo. Heretics are being fired, defunded, shot at, silenced. And then President Obama said, 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous. The 97% number is completely fake and has no basis in reality. And the imaginary consensus is maintained by intimidating and silencing anyone who would speak against it. Everyone involved with climate science knows the rules and knows the danger of speaking up, so most choose to remain silent. What we are seeing is the climate inquisition. President Obama just bought a $15 million mansion on the beach at Martha's Vineyard. He obviously does not believe the hype he's been promoting about sea level rise. So let's listen to what Obama's agenda actually was.
Under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket. Even, regardless of what I say about whether coal is good or bad, because I'm capping greenhouse gases, coal-powered plants, natural gas, you name it, whatever the plants were, whatever the industry was, they would have to retrofit their operations. That will cost money. They will pass that money on to consumers.
We were rescued from Obama's utterly insane plans by the fracking boom which took place on private land. He couldn't do anything about it and probably didn't even know about it until it was well underway. Now let's listen to his words of wisdom about how drilling can't lower energy costs.
You can anticipate we're going to be hearing a lot about how people have these magic 3-point plans to make sure that you're only paying $2 a gallon gas. Just like we heard about it in the last election, just like we've heard about it for the last 30 years. And you know what the essence of their plan is going to be, which is step 1, drill, step 2, drill, step 3, keep drilling. Now, if there's one thing I know about New Hampshire, it's that your political bull detector is pretty keen. It's pretty sharp. You know that we can't just drill our way to lower gas prices. There are no quick fixes or silver bullets. If somebody tells you there are, they're not telling you the truth.
Now let's look at what the fracking boom actually did. The fracking boom caused gasoline prices to plummet. Imagine the damage to the economy and how many people would have been hurt had Obama been successful at making electricity prices skyrocket. What's going on with climate alarmism is a political agenda. It has nothing to do with science. And anyone who goes up against the climate orthodoxy gets treated like Galileo, gets treated as a heretic. I only listed a few names in this video, but there are lots of other academics who've been treated in similar fashion for being climate skeptics. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been playing back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Over the past 12 months, we've been bombarded with a huge amount of propaganda about record heat and burning up. And while all this was going on, it's also been one of the coolest 12 months on record in the United States. Let's look at the stats. This is the average daily maximum temperature from October 1st to September 31st of the following year for all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. And if you look at the bottom right corner here, you can see that this year has been the third coolest on record. This year was about 5 degrees cooler than 1934, and you can see that recent years were much cooler than the 1930s and the 1950s. This next graph shows the percent of days above 80 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 12 months. Once again, you can see that this year was one of the coolest on record. Same for the percent of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Very cool, and the trend over the past century has been sharply down. And the same story for 95-degree days, which are down almost 50% from the 1930s. Now I'm going to take the same plot, and instead of plotting time across the x-axis, I'm going to plot carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can see that as carbon dioxide has increased, the percentage of hot days in the United States has decreased sharply. This shows us unequivocally that there's no reason to believe that increasing carbon dioxide levels will cause more extreme heat. Now let's look at the average mean temperature instead of the average maximum temperature. Once again, you can see that the past 12 months have been one of the coolest on record. If we take the previous graph and limit the date range to just the past century, we can see that mean temperatures have been declining in the US for 100 years. This next graph is very interesting. It's the average temperature difference between the daily maximum and the daily minimum. In 1934, there was an average difference between daytime highs and nighttime lows of 26 degrees. But this year was the lowest on record, only 22 degrees. This is because daytime highs are getting lower and nighttime lows are getting warmer, which means that we're having less extreme weather. We're having less extremely hot weather, and we're having less extremely cold weather. Less extreme weather is not a story climate alarmists want you to hear. The past 12 months have also been the wettest 12 months on record in the United States. Almost the entire country has been above normal precipitation. It's not at all surprising that one of the coolest years was also the wettest year. Cool air can't hold as much moisture as hot air, which is why we get rain and snow at frontal boundaries when cold air comes through. Once again, this is the exact opposite of what climate alarmists want you to believe. This map shows departure from normal temperature in the United States over the past 12 months. Two key things to note is that it was extremely cold in the north-central part of the country and was warm in the southeast. On January 31st of this year, Illinois set their all-time cold temperature record of minus 38 degrees. And also this year, Montana set their all-time March cold record. At the end of February, the Washington Post reported that Montana just endured one of the nation's most exceptional cold snaps on record. So that's why we're seeing these very cold temperatures in the north-central U.S. Let's take a closer look at that. This is the average daily maximum temperature over the past 12 months at all of the north-central United States states. As you can see, 2019 was the coolest on record in that region. This was 9 degrees cooler than the warmest year of 2012. Now let's take a look at the southeastern U.S. The southeastern U.S. is very interesting because after the mid-1950s, there was a huge drop in temperatures. It's increased some since then, and this year was a little bit below average. So if this year is a little bit below average, then why does this map show the southeast U.S. above normal? The reason can be seen in this graph of daily minimum temperatures. Nighttime temperatures in the southeastern U.S. have increased sharply over the last few years. This leads us back to my previous graph showing the average daily temperature range. Daytime highs are getting lower, nighttime lows are getting higher. So we're having a smaller gap between daytime and nighttime temperatures. Less extreme heat and less extreme cold. That's a good thing. It's a milder climate. But that isn't what climate alarmists are reporting. The Union of Concerned Scientists says, killer heat in the United States, climate choices in the future of dangerously hot days, 2019. Extreme heat is poised to rise steeply in frequency and severity over the coming decades, bringing unprecedented health risks for people and communities across the country. These people are committing fraud. There's no reason to believe any of the things which they're saying. This graph from Oxford University shows the global annual death rate from natural disasters, including extreme temperature. As you can see, over the past 100 years, the frequency of deaths has declined sharply. By contrast, the heat wave of July 1936 brought 12,000 dead in 1 week in the United States. So let's look closely at the sentence. Extreme heat is poised to rise steeply in frequency and severity over the coming decades. That's simply not true. There's no scientific basis to that claim. Then they say, bringing unprecedented health risks for people and communities across the country. This is complete nonsense. And then up here they talk about climate choices. Once again, this is complete nonsense. As we've already seen, CO2 does not control extreme temperatures. And we also know that the United States has very little control over global atmospheric CO2 levels. China and India are building hundreds of new coal-fired power plants. There's nothing the United States can do to control either CO2 levels or the climate. Everything the Union of Concerned Scientists is saying is completely false. Then they show you some pictures of hot people, and then comes the punchline. They want $1,000 of your money. This is a classic confidence scheme ripoff. They're trying to create an imaginary problem in the reader's mind, and then they're asking them for money to solve it. Climate alarmists are the Bernie Madoffs of science. The only difference being that their confidence scam is much larger than Bernie Madoff's was. There is no climate crisis. There is no reason to believe that extreme heat is going to increase in the U.S. There is no reason to believe that the U.S. can control the climate. The only thing that's true about these concerned scientists is that they want your money. The last thing climate alarmists want Americans to know about is our very hot past. George Orwell said, the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. That's exactly what climate alarmists are doing, and they're trying to rip off your money in the process. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Many current news stories start out with the words, scientists say. It's an appeal to authority, and the intent is to get you to turn off your brain and believe anything they say. Let's look at a sample of some of those articles. The Weekend Australian, September 5th, 2012. Enjoy snow now. By 2020, it'll be gone. Environmental researchers say the end of Australia's ski culture is in sight, despite Victoria and New South Wales experiencing one of their best snow seasons in almost a decade. In other words, never mind what you see out your window, we know better. We're scientists. Well, they better hurry up with their predictions because they've only got a few more weeks, and people in Australia are going to be skiing at least through mid-October. This recent picture from Australia doesn't look so much like the end of snow. Here's another one from the Sydney Morning Herald from 2008, predicting a permanent drought in southeast Australia. January 4th, 2008, it may be time to stop describing southeastern Australia as gripped with drought and instead accept the extreme dry as permanent, one of the nation's most senior weather experts warned yesterday. Perhaps we should call it our new climate, said the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones. And then 2 years later, Australia was so wet, it was causing global sea level to drop. So did David Jones at BOM learn anything from this? No, he's doing exactly the same thing with the current drought. Climate alarmists seem to be incapable of learning anything from their mistakes. February 12, 2012. Drought may be the new norm for the UK, says Environment Secretary. The UK was flooded a few weeks later. The Independent, Monday, March 20th, 2000. Snowfalls are now just a thing of the past. They quoted David Viner from the Climatic Research Unit as saying, children just aren't going to know what snow is. Well, I got caught in the Robbie Burns night blizzard of 2003 in Cambridge when there were 11,000 cars stuck on the M11 in deep snow. A lot of children were seeing snow that night. It was very cold and was lucky nobody froze to death. Most of these need no explanation, so I'm just going to run through them pretty quick. The Independent, May 2004, why Antarctica will soon be the only place to live. Antarctica is likely to be the world's only habitable continent by the end of the century if global warming remains unchecked. The government's chief scientist, Professor Sir David King, said last week. The Telegraph, October 2008, climate change study predicts refugees fleeing into Antarctica. The Guardian, February 2004, Pentagon tells Bush climate change will destroy us. Britain will be Siberian by the year 2020. Nuclear conflict, mega droughts, famine, and widespread rioting will erupt across the world, all in the next few weeks. New York Times, February 2014, the end of snow. New York Times, December 2006, endless summer. It goes hand in hand with polar bears dying in the Arctic as the sea ice shrinks. Washington Post, March 2012, could cherry blossoms one day be blooming in winter? That could mean a bloom process that begins in January and a blooming period in February instead of March. Cherry trees blooming in Washington, D.C. in February? What are these people smoking? BBC, December 2007, Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. In the end, it will just all melt away quite suddenly, Professor Peter Wadhams, Cambridge University. Sierra Club, why Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. The Guardian, July 2013, ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe, scientist. January 1979, Stephen Schneider of the National Center for Atmospheric Research and Robert Chen of MIT predicting 15 to 25-foot rise in sea level. And it will start before the year 2000. May 1st, 1983, because of man-made global warming trend, world sea level over the next several decades could reach heights unprecedented in the history of civilization, says the draft of a major study by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agencies. The seas, which have been relatively stable during the last 6,000 years, could rise anywhere from a few feet to more than 10 feet. Large parts of the Gulf Coast and Florida would be underwater. Well, it's almost 30 years later, and I'm pretty sure Florida is still there. Canberra Times, January 1988. Governments must yield national sovereignty to multilateral authorities able to enforce laws across environmentally invisible frontiers if the greenhouse effect, which threatens the future of whole nations, is to be overcome, the Commonwealth Secretary General said on Tuesday. A Commonwealth expert group set up to look at climate change estimated there was a 90% certainty that sea levels would rise by between 1 and 4 meters by the year 2030. So unless we all immediately adopt global communism, sea level is going to rise like 15 feet in the next 10 years. Canberra Times, September 1988. The Maldives to be completely drowned within 30 years. That would be last year. The Saudis seem to have a different opinion as they're investing $10 billion in the Maldives right now. Guardian 2010. Sometime in the next decade, we may pass that tipping point, which will put us warmer than temperatures that Greenland can survive. The fallout would be felt thousands of miles away from the Arctic, unleashing a global sea level rise of 23 feet, 7 meters, Ali warned. Wow, 23 feet of sea level rise by the year 2020. That sounds terrible. Washington Post, July 1971. U.S. scientist sees new ice age coming. The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age, a leading atmospheric scientist predicts. Dr. S.I. Rasool of NASA and Columbia University says that. 50 years from 1971, that puts us just a year away from a new ice age. Science News, March 1975, the ice age cometh. There it is, there's the glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. Time Magazine, June 1974, another ice age. Telltale signs are everywhere. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. June 2017, 4 years to save the earth. 2020 is the deadline to avert climate catastrophe, experts claim in chilling commentary. October 6, 1970, Paul Ehrlich of Stanford University. The oceans will be dead as Lake Erie in less than a decade. America will be subject to water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. March 1977, the Carter administration predicted the world would run out of oil during the first decade of the 21st century. Well, today is President Carter's 95th birthday, and I'm pretty sure he's still using cars. December 1923, Glacier National Park to be ice-free in another 25 years. That would be 1948. Well, apparently that didn't happen because in 1952, scientists predicted that Glacier National Park would be ice-free in 50 years. Well, apparently that didn't happen either because in 2009, scientists predicted that Glacier National Park would be ice-free by the year 2020. Well, that's not going to happen. So now the New York Times is predicting that Glacier National Park will be ice-free by the year 2044. That's almost a century past the original forecast date. This is what Glacier National Park looks like today. They had one of their coldest winters on record last year, and this year winter is starting extremely early. Somehow I don't think National Geographic is going to get their prediction right that it will be ice-free in the next few weeks. Climate is cyclical. Here's a record of droughts and floods in Australia starting back in the year 1789. 1789 drought, 1791 drought, 1797 drought, flood, 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 slight drought, flood, severe drought, flood, flood, slight drought, flood, 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 slight drought, flood, severe drought, flood, 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 slight drought, extreme drought, extreme drought, extreme drought. Climate alarmists have long-term memory issues, and they look at whatever the current weather is and assume that's the trend that's going to go on forever. But the reality is that drought is always followed by flood, and flood is always followed by drought. And the other reality is that some people have a need to get hysterical about everything they see going on around them. Here's an article from 1846 on the change of climate. That great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia, all testimonies satisfactorily prove. The Aborigines say that the climate has undergone this change since white man came into the country. That was more than 170 years ago. Apparently, another constant is that white men always get blamed for climate change. And this is my favorite article from 1871, Brisbane Courier, Imaginary Changes of Climate. A plentiful crop of speculation from weather prophets and projectors and half-instructed meteorologists and all the philosophic tribe of Laputa in general, to whom the periodical press now affords such fatal facilities. Every season is sure to be extraordinary, almost every month one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. So exactly the same story as we see now. Climate change hysteria does seem to be working off the principle of natural selection. The BBC had this article today. Couples rethinking kids because of climate change. In the age of climate crisis, childbearing has become a fraught question for couples around the globe. So let's take a look at the actual globe. The populations of the Middle East and Africa are growing more than 3% per year. So while Europeans and Americans kill themselves off, less neurotic people are going to take over the planet. But to be fair, I did find one accurate prediction in the Babylon Bee. Experts warn that we only have 12 years left until they change the timeline on global warming again. Climate experts have solemnly warned that we only have 12 years left until they change the dates on global warming again. If we don't take action, then in 12 years we'll have to explain why the world hasn't ended and come up with a new number, one UN scientist warned. This is a very serious threat, and we urge everyone to hand control of the economy to the government immediately, for we have no more time left to change the timeline again. The scientific consensus is that roughly 10 to 12 years from now, the world will be flooded with new doomsday predictions. This can all be avoided if we overhaul the economy and become socialists, according to non-political, unbiased, science-y type guys. Should we not change our ways, our old predictions will melt, dangerously raising the chance of us having to move the goalposts again, said Al Gore. Do you really want me to write another book, film another movie, and go on another tour in my private jet just because you dingbats couldn't be bothered to alter your lifestyles? I don't think so. Let's all get on board with this 12-year figure, or we'll have to push back the date again. Personally, I think it would be a good idea if some climate experts flee to Antarctica. Richard Feynman said, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." There can be little doubt that he was absolutely correct, at least when it comes to climate. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The NBC morning meteorologist for the DC area made an amazing tweet this morning. Chuck Bell 4, one of the atmospheric response to radical heat in the east is record snow in the west. It's all part of our changing climate. The tweet doesn't make sense grammatically, but I think it's obvious what he's trying to say. He's saying it's hot in the east and it's snowing in the west and it's due to climate change. So I did about 10 minutes of research and found out that every single thing he said was wrong. Iowa State Register, Sunday, September 22nd, 1895. Snow in the west, hot in east. Snow in Dakota, Montana, and Colorado, different in east. New York, September 21st. According to the official record today, was the hottest day of the year with a thermometer touching 97 degrees. Springfield, Massachusetts, September 21st. The thermometer registered 105 degrees here today. Brattleboro, Massachusetts, September 21st. This was the hottest day of the season. The thermometer reached 105 degrees. Rawlins, Wyoming, September 21st. A heavy northeast snowstorm began early this morning. It's now 8 inches deep and still snowing. There are some fears for sheep still in the mountains. If it should turn cold, there will be heavy losses. So this week in 1895, it was 105 degrees in the northeast and heavy snow in the west. Well, that's a lot hotter than this here in the east. So it's pretty clear already that Chuck Bell has absolutely no clue what he's talking about. This was U.S. temperatures on September 21st, 1895. Pink means over 100 degrees. You can see it was over 100 degrees in the northeast. It was cold in the west. Now let's look at some other years. October 6th, 1951. Hot in east, snow in west. Snow fell in some western states today, but it was still summer-like weather in most of the eastern and southern states. So there was heavy snow in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where I'll be having dinner this weekend. It was 94 degrees at Washington, D.C., where Chuck Bell works. Here's another one from September 21st, 1983. Hot in east, cold in Midwest, snow in Montana. And here's one from July 1986. A hot weekend for the east, but snow in Montana Rockies. So if we go back and look at Chuck Bell's tweet again, we can see how ridiculous it is. The heat in the east is not at all radical, and there's nothing unusual about it being hot in the east and snowing in the west. Here's the weather map from this date in 1953. There were 100-degree temperatures from California up into Indiana. It was 103 degrees at Madison, Indiana on this date in 1953. Now let's compare that with this week's weather. The pattern is very similar, only this week is a lot cooler. It's only 91 degrees in Indiana instead of over 100 degrees. This graph shows the September 30th average maximum temperature at all southeastern U.S. United States Historical Climatology Network stations. You can see that end of September temperatures in the southeast peaked in 1904, and they've been declining ever since. And this graph shows the percent of stations in the southeastern U.S. which are over 90 degrees on September 30th. You can see that that's plummeted since the 19th century. Prior to 60 years ago, the southeastern U.S. was frequently very hot on September 30th. But recent years have been the coolest on record. People just aren't used to the normal weather anymore. Well, that's strike two for Chuck Bell. Now let's throw the third pitch. Chuck Bell is trying to blame heavy snow on global warming. But in the 2001 IPCC report, they said mild winter temperatures will decrease heavy snowstorms. And in the year 2000, David Viner of the Climatic Research Unit in England said, children just aren't going to know what snow is. Well, children in Montana are buried up to their waist in snow right now. after last year being one of the coldest winters on record in Montana. At the end of February, the Washington Post reported that Montana just endured one of the nation's most exceptional cold spells on record. And on March 4th, Montana set their all-time record for March cold. So that's strike 3 for Chuck Bell. And I've sent all this information to him. What are the odds he'll make a correction? Well, if history is any guide, the odds are pretty close to zero. Climate alarmists never correct themselves because there's no benefit to them to tell the truth. But there are tremendous rewards for them for continuing to push the climate crisis scam. The only thing we can do is keep calling them out and letting more and more people know that they're being scammed. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. If I was Greta Thunberg's teacher, she wouldn't be scared and she would be in school. 16-year-old children should be in school, getting an education and enjoying their friends. They should be preparing for their future. They should not be used for propaganda by the adults around them. I spent 3 years teaching high school science at a boarding school in Arizona, which was specifically set up for troubled children like Greta. I'll talk more about that later, but first I want to show you what I would be teaching Greta if I was her teacher. I would teach her that as greenhouse gases have increased over the past century, global death rates from natural disasters have gone way down. I would teach her that as greenhouse gases have increased, global life expectancy has increased tremendously. I would teach Greta that crop yields have increased tremendously as greenhouse gases have increased in the atmosphere. I would teach her that Earth has gotten much greener as greenhouse gases have increased, and that's a good thing. I would teach her that plants can't grow without greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and water. I would teach her that life on Earth grew at its fastest rate when carbon dioxide was at its peak 540 million years ago, and that was much higher than it is now. I would teach her that life thrived on Earth when greenhouse gas levels were much higher in the atmosphere. I would teach her that science is a beautiful thing and it's not something to be scared of. I would teach her that scientists get things wrong all the time. When I was her age, we were being warned about a new ice age. I would teach her that when I was her age, the United Nations was warning that global cooling was going to cause entire nations to disappear from the face of the earth. I would teach her that long before she was born, the United Nations said that we had to solve global warming before the year 2000. I would teach her that climate alarmists predicted Europe would be a Siberian climate by the year 2020. I would teach her that back in 1878, 50 million people died in a drought and famine, and that had nothing to do with carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. I would teach her that back in 1916, she couldn't have gone to school. The schools were closed because of a massive outbreak of polio. These children had their future ruined by polio, and Greta should appreciate the good health she has. I would teach her that in 1918, 20 to 40 million people were killed by the flu. I would teach her that 100 years ago, 200 million people in Europe faced starvation. I would teach her how lucky she is that she doesn't have to face all of these calamities of the past and what a charmed life she's living. But most importantly, I would teach her to enjoy life. When I left the school in Arizona 30 years ago, my students made a scrapbook of some of our adventures. These are the kinds of things which children Greta's age should be doing. They should be having fun. We had a blast at that school. Besides being the science teacher, I was also the soccer coach and the athletic director. We were always playing soccer, going on field trips. One of the most fun things we did was this camping field trip up to Lake Powell. The kids were always having a blast. Most importantly, I taught them an appreciation of nature. I ran into these twins in Scottsdale about a year ago. They will be 50 years old in a few weeks, but they told me they still remember almost everything I taught them. Now let's compare their life to Greta's life. Greta's parents won't allow anyone to tell her good news about climate or nature. Public schools also won't allow students to hear any good news about climate or nature. And journalists won't allow people to hear any good news about anything. We have institutionalized child abuse. It permeates politics, the press, the schools, and many parents. Voltaire said, "He who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." And that's exactly what's going on here. The absurdity of global warming alarmism is causing atrocities against children like Greta. It's long past time to put an end to this child abuse and insanity. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. After I made my last video, I remembered one more computer modeling project I did way back in 1974, at the peak of the global cooling scare. That was an interesting project, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about consensus science. 30 years ago, the United Nations announced that if we didn't solve global warming by the year 2000, entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth. June 30th, 1989, grim forecast. A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos, said Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. So apparently the world ended before Greta was born, but it's much worse than that. In 1974, the United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim said we only had a few months to save the planet from global cooling. He said if sufficient action isn't taken in the next few months, countries could disappear from the face of the earth. April 2nd to 8th, 1974. The UN must have an official playbook with the words, countries could disappear from the face of the earth. And it's right there in Australia's Communist Weekly newspaper. That sounds really bad, but it gets even worse. Experts said that America would have water rationing by 1974 and food rationing by 1980. Here's a very serious article from 1974. San Francisco, imagine this global scenario. A devastating once-in-a-century drought sweeps across the Soviet Union, resulting in the most disastrous wheat crop failure in recent Russian history. Several thousand miles away, the cold surface waters of the Humboldt Current off the Pacific coast of South America temporarily disappear, virtually destroying Peru's anchovy fishery and setting off a worldwide shortage in poultry feed and raising the price of chicken in the United States. In India and much of Southeast Asia, the all-important monsoon season come 3 weeks late. As a result, the rice harvest is only half the normal level. And in Africa, the Sahara Desert shifts southward, causing widespread famine, uncounted deaths, and migration of more than 13 million persons. These climate-induced disasters are not, of course, imaginary. All took place during the summer of 1972, and their effects are still being felt around the world. To consider some of the urgent questions that a changing climate poses for the world, several of America's most prominent meteorologists gathered here last week for discussions at the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. What emerged was a grim forecast for the future. It was generally agreed that the extraordinary warmth of the early 20th century is drawing to a close and that a global cooling trend has been underway since about 1940, but the scientists cannot explain why. So look at all those horrible disasters which global cooling caused. Same story in Time magazine, June 24th, 1974, another ice age. In Africa, drought continues for the 6th consecutive year, adding terribly to the toll of famine victims. During 1972, record rains in parts of the U.S., Pakistan, and Japan caused some of the worst flooding in centuries. Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest. Since the 1940s, the mean global temperature has dropped about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Chicago Tribune, March 2nd, 1975. New ice age on way soon? In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time this century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place, a shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age like that which gripped much of the northern hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. The cover of Science News, March 1st, 1975, The Ice Age Cometh, Glaciers Plowing Through Manhattan. Nothing steals your childhood like a glacier plowing through your living room. Des Moines Sunday Register, July 21st, 1974, World is getting cooler. And there was the graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research showing temperatures plummeting since the 1940s. That's what global temperature graphs look like before Michael Mann and NASA rewrote the world's history during the 1990s. And there was unanimous consensus. New York Times, January 30th, 1961. Scientists agree world is colder. An assembly of specialists from several continents seems to have reached unanimous agreement on only one point. It's getting colder. March 11th, 1979. One thing is indisputable. The world's been cooling off since World War II. But no worries, the scientists were on top of this. They had a solution to global cooling. They were just going to put soot on the Arctic ice cap and melt it. I was experiencing global cooling in Arizona in 1974. I was a freshman at Arizona State University and playing on the soccer team. It was a little bit warm that year. Phoenix had 18 consecutive days over 110 degrees, and nearby Buckeye had 21 consecutive days, which was a record for both places. We held soccer practice every afternoon outdoors at 3 o'clock, no matter what the temperature was, and most days was over 105 degrees. The 1974 heat wave wasn't Arizona's record, though, for days over 110 degrees. That actually occurred in 1929, when Parker had 24 consecutive days above 110 degrees. And Arizona's longest stretch over 120 degrees occurred twice, once in 1896 and once in 1905. Both times they had 7 consecutive days over 120 degrees. But now let's go to the computer modeling project I was doing at Arizona State in 1974. Prior to the 1970s, golf balls looked like this. They had dimples and straight lines. But if you look at golf balls now, they have a beehive pattern with no straight lines. And there's a reason for that. With the old style golf balls, sometimes the ball would behave like a knuckleball. In order for a golf ball to fly stably, the dimples have to create turbulence around the ball. And if the ball was spinning parallel to these straight lines, there'd be regions where it was smooth and there was no turbulence being created. Thus, your golf ball would sometimes do crazy things and behave more like a knuckleball thrown by a pitcher than what a golf ball flight's supposed to look like. So I worked with a physicist from Los Alamos, and for my final project at ASU that semester, I modeled the flight of golf balls. Well, I love computers, but I didn't major in computer science because my brother was doing that and I didn't want to follow in his footsteps. So I went into geology instead, where I learned about consensus science. In 1929, Alfred Wegener published these maps. They showed the position of the continents at previous times in Earth's history. He was the first person to present the theory that continents moved. Any geologist who's paying the slightest bit of attention should have been aware of the fact that land moves. You can actually see the land moving in places like Hollister, California. So let's look at how the consensus dealt with Wegener's hypothesis. Utter damned rot, said the president of the prestigious American Philosophical Society. If we are to believe this hypothesis, we must forget everything we've learned in the last 70 years and start all over again, said another American scientist. Anyone who valued his reputation for scientific sanity would never dare support such a theory, said a British geologist. Thus did most in the scientific community ridicule the concept that would revolutionize the earth sciences and revile the man who dared to propose it. German meteorological pioneer and polar explorer Alfred Wegener. Science historians compare his story with the tribulations of Galileo. My professor at Arizona State University, Bob Dietz, was the guy who ended up finally breaking the consensus down. 50 or 60 years after Wegener proposed his obviously correct theory, the scientific consensus finally accepted it. Now let's talk about another consensus in Arizona. Percival Lowell was a wealthy Massachusetts businessman who decided to set up an observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona. That's where the planet Pluto was discovered before the scientific consensus erased Pluto as a planet. Lowell spent many hours staring through his telescope at Mars and determined that there were canals up there. Sunday morning, January 20th, 1901, a few days ago, a startling announcement was made to the effect that Professor A.E. Douglas of the Flagstaff Observatory, Arizona, had received a message from Mars. And Tesla, the guy who Tesla cars is named after, was actually talking to the Martians. By 1909, the New York Times and leading astronomers had determined that the canals were there for drainage. And over the next 2 years, the New York Times watched the Martians doing vast engineering projects, building 2 immense canals. By early October, 100 years ago, the fact that the Martian canals exist is no longer doubted even by the most religious astronomer. No one doubts today that these canals are parts of an enormous irrigation system which supplies water to the desert inlands. But apparently there was still one doubter left, because in 1927, the New York Times reported that he finally agreed that there was life on Mars. And in 1996, around the time they were rewriting the temperature record, NASA was still saying that there was life on Mars. And in 1998, the year when Michael Mann published his hockey stick graph, NASA was still sticking to the life on Mars story. So we should ask, what happened to the consensus science of life on Mars? Well, obviously the Martians were wiped out by global warming. So now I want to finish up with a discussion of my stolen childhood and political correctness. I survived the heat of 1974, but one thing which didn't survive was my fraternity house. New Fraternity Row was the life of the campus back in 1974. There'd be bands down there every Friday and Saturday night. The whole campus would come down there and party. We had an incredibly fun time. But fraternities are politically incorrect, so a couple of years ago, the university tore the houses down. I was just a few months older than Greta Thunberg when I started college, but I wasn't off trying to save the planet. I was there to get an education and have fun like a 17-year-old should be doing. I don't have any doubt that Greta Thunberg's childhood has been stolen, but it isn't by the climate, it's by the unscrupulous adults which surround her. Children should be out having fun. They shouldn't have adults telling them that they have to save the planet. The way we survived the heat of 1974 in Phoenix was we'd go out on the river tubing, and we'd bring a tube full of beer, and we'd have a great time. And that's how I survived my stolen childhood, having fun. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to show you how the legal basis behind climate alarmism is based on politics and not science. The EPA's CO2 endangerment finding is the document which gives climate alarmists the ability to shut down our fossil fuel infrastructure. Without this document, alarmists have no legal basis to do anything. The endangerment finding was created by the EPA during President Obama's first year in office. And as I'm going to show you in the next few minutes, it has no scientific basis. This graph was created from data downloaded from Our World in Data, a website run by Oxford University. On the y-axis is global death rates from natural disasters per 100,000 people. And on the x-axis is atmospheric CO2 increasing from left to right. Over the past century, atmospheric CO2 has increased from about 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million. And during that time, death rates from natural disasters has plummeted to close to zero. Reality is the exact opposite of the belief system behind the CO2 endangerment finding. Now let's look at global life expectancy. Life expectancy is more than doubled as CO2 has increased from 300 parts per million to over 400 parts per million. When atmospheric CO2 was 300 parts per million, life expectancy around the world was less than 40 years. But now it's over 70 years. Once again, reality is the exact opposite of the belief system behind the CO2 endangerment finding. Now let's look at crop yields. As CO2 has increased from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million, corn productivity in the U.S. has increased by 500%. This shouldn't surprise anyone. Commercial greenhouse operators pump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere of the greenhouse to make the plants grow faster. A few years ago, NASA did a study showing that Earth has gotten much greener over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Green plants love and need carbon dioxide. Most people learn this in elementary school. Plant growth requires sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and chlorophyll, which makes the green color in leaves. These combine to produce plant growth and oxygen. The reason we have oxygen in our atmosphere in abundance is because we have plants. And the reason we have plants is because we have carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Classifying one of the basic requirements of life as a pollutant is simply obscene. The greatest explosion of life on Earth occurred 540 million years ago during the Cambrian era, when atmospheric CO2 was right at its peak of about 7,000 parts per million. That's almost 20 times as much carbon dioxide as in the atmosphere now. Life thrived on Earth during times when atmospheric CO2 was much higher than it is at present. People who claim that increasing levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide threaten life with extinction have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. The geological history of the Earth tells us the exact opposite. So we've seen that higher levels of CO2 are very safe and productive. Now let's look at lower levels of CO2. Yesterday in my video, I discussed the year 1878, which brought the worst drought and famine in history. Carbon dioxide levels were below 300 parts per million at the time. This article is from February 2nd, 1878 from the Australasian newspaper. The month of January 1878 will be long remembered by the farming community as a period of heat and drought scarcely ever known or experienced in this colony before. On Thursday the 10th last, the heat was most intense, the thermometer registering 123 degrees in the shade and 158 degrees in the sun. The weather still continues extremely hot and dry. The absence of rain is causing great anxiety among all classes of the community. Sheep and cattle are almost famishing for want of feed and water. Meanwhile, in the United States, there was no winter in Minnesota that year. Minneapolis Tribune, March 19, 1878, a wonderful winter. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There is nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that give us such a winter and spring as we have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we've had no winter weather in Minnesota. It's hard to imagine no winter in Minnesota, particularly after last winter's record cold. Last winter, Illinois set their all-time cold record of minus 39 degrees. 50 million people died in the record heat and drought during 1878. Scientists explained the unprecedented extreme weather of 1878 as being due to ocean circulation patterns. This tells us two things. One is that expecting that lower levels of CO2 will prevent extreme weather is nonsense. And two, CO2 does not control extreme weather. So once again, the basis of the CO2 endangerment finding is complete nonsense. Last week, the United Nations transferred a child on a multi-million-dollar yacht from Sweden to speak at the United Nations headquarters. The plan was for her to tell the world that her childhood had been stolen by rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The lines on her script read, "You have stolen my dreams." 500,000 people died in Brazil in 1878 during the low CO2 drought and famine. Most of these were children. I'm sure that they would have been happy to trade places with the charmed life of Greta Thunberg. Let's go back now to the CO2 endangerment finding. It is based on two key lines of evidence. One is the global temperature record, and the other is output of climate models. Let's see what climate expert Dr. Nakamura has to say about that. Dr. Nakamura received a doctorate of science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and for nearly 25 years specialized in abnormal weather and climate change at prestigious institutions which included MIT, Georgia Tech, NASA, JPL, Caltech, JAMSTEC, and Duke University. In his book, The Global Warming Hypothesis is Unproven, Dr. Nakamura explains why the data foundation underpinning global warming science is untrustworthy and cannot be relied on. Global mean temperatures before 1980 are based on untrustworthy data, writes Nakamura. Before full planet surface observation by satellite began in 1980, only a small part of the Earth had been observed for temperatures with only a certain amount of accuracy and frequency. Across the globe, only North America and Western Europe have trustworthy temperature data going back to the 19th century. From 1990 to 2014, Nakamura worked on cloud dynamics and forces mixing atmospheric and ocean flows on medium to planetary scales. He's published more than 20 climate papers on fluid dynamics. Today's global warming science is akin to an upside-down pyramid which is built on the work of a few climate modelers who claim to have demonstrated human-derived CO2 emissions as the cause of recently rising temperatures, and have then simply projected that warming forward. Every climate researcher thereafter has taken the results of these original models as a given, and we're even at the stage now where merely testing their validity is regarded as heresy. Some computer models are extremely valuable and others are completely useless. I'm going to talk now a little bit about my modeling experience and then explain why it's important. I've worked with and developed computer models for most of the last 40 years. The first modeling I did was modeling heat flow around geothermal energy sources in New Mexico at Los Alamos National Laboratories. Then I did modeling at Los Alamos Labs of fracturing of oil shales. The most fun modeling I did at Los Alamos, though, wasn't computer models. It was actual physical models of volcanoes where we got to blow things up at a high explosives testing facility. I've got lots of good stories to tell about that. My next modeling job was modeling groundwater flow around the Department of Energy's nuclear waste site in southeastern New Mexico. I've done software development on climate and weather models for the National Center for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado. I was hired by NCAR to find ways to make their climate models run faster, so I know quite a bit about how they work. I did the same thing for NCAR's weather models, and I also ported their weather models over from Linux to Windows. The point being that I'm talking about a field which I'm somewhat familiar with. I worked for many years as a microprocessor designer for companies like Intel, Motorola, IBM, Apple, ST Microelectronics, Cyrex, National Semiconductor, and even founded a microprocessor startup with a few colleagues. There's a pretty high probability that I helped design the brain of your computer and your game console. My specialty was writing computer models to test performance and to flesh out errors in the designs. I was given this award by IBM, Apple, and Motorola. The PowerPC 604 RISC microprocessor, made functional by Tony Debug God Heller. But I couldn't have done this without computer models, couldn't even have come close. I also helped design the world's first 2 billion transistor microprocessor at Intel. Modern electronics could not be designed without computer models, but not all models are equal. You can't model something unless you can explain it. Climate models cannot explain the extreme heat, drought, and famine of 1878. They can't even come close. Climate models can't explain the heat wave of 1896, 1901, 1911, 1913, 1916, 1918, 1921, 1927, 1930, 1931, 1934, 1936, 1954, 1980, or any others. Climate models are academic toys which can't explain the past and certainly can't predict the future. Imagine you wrote a computer model based on the idea that Liverpool's football club is going to win all of their matches by 1 or 2 goals. And then you used the output of that model to prove that Liverpool was going to win all of their matches by 1 or 2 goals in the future. Well, obviously that's nonsense. It's garbage in, garbage out. The model simply reflects the bias of the person who wrote it. And that's how climate models work. They're based around the idea that CO2 controls the climate. The only thing which the output of a climate model proves is the inherent biases of the person who wrote the climate model. There's no reason to believe that the output of a climate model will have any predictive skill of future climate. This is completely different from the kind of models we used in developing microprocessors, which were 100% accurate. So the two things which the CO2 endangerment finding is primarily based on are both fraudulent. One is the global temperature record, which, as Dr. Nakamura explained, is completely unreliable, and the other is climate models, which have no useful predictive skill. And the CO2 endangerment finding is being used by climate alarmists to shut down the reliable energy supply in the United States. Most people just take for granted the idea that when they go to the gas station, there'll be gas there. When they turn on the light switch, there'll be light. When they turn on the heat, there'll be heat. When they turn on the air conditioning, there'll be air conditioning. When they go to the airport, the planes will have fuel to fly. We can't imagine how difficult our world would be without that. What if truck drivers couldn't get fuel to bring food to the stores? How would that affect us? We also take breathing for granted, but if you've ever had your windpipe choked off by food, you find out that your whole world can collapse in a matter of seconds. The CO2 endangerment finding and its planned abuse by people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez is incredibly dangerous to all of us. The abuse of this document by clueless climate alarmists has the ability to end civilization as we know it. Climate alarmists maintain the simple-minded idea that we can replace our massive infrastructure based on fossil fuels with things like windmills and electric cars. I'm an electrical engineer, and these people have no idea what they're talking about. The scale of this undertaking is absolutely enormous. And there are massive technical hurdles which nobody has any clue how to deal with at this point in time. Things like the fact that the sun doesn't shine at night. It doesn't shine much in the winter or on cloudy days. The wind doesn't blow all the time. Manufacturing electric cars carries tremendous environmental costs, and they have very short range. Could you imagine if every car on the interstate highway had to stop every hour or two and spend an hour or two recharging? The logistics would be completely unworkable. Our interstate highway commercial transport system would be shut down. Our civilization depends on a reliable supply of very large amounts of high energy density liquid fuels. Our civilization can't survive without that any more than our bodies can survive without oxygen. This is not to say that we can't cut way back on our wastage of fossil fuels. We're terrible about that. We need to become much more efficient, cleaner, and preserve fossil fuels for future generations. But simply shutting down the fossil fuel supply would be suicide. George Orwell said, "So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot." Carbon dioxide is not dangerous, but having an inadequate supply of energy would be extremely dangerous. We need to get this political document from the Obama administration shut down and removed as a threat to our society. It has no legitimate basis in science and needs to be reversed. Speak to your representatives in Washington and demand that the EPA endangerment finding is revisited and reversed. And visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to talk about some incredibly hot weather from the past, which is now being hidden by NASA and the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. I made this graph from the NASA 2001 version of monthly global temperature anomalies. This data is no longer available on the NASA website as they erase all of their prior data every month. NASA attempts to impede the Internet Archive from archiving their old data sets, but occasionally a few do get archived. This version from 2001 did get archived, and it showed March of 1878 as being the most anomalously warm month on record. And it showed a lot of very hot weather prior to the year 1880. The 2001 data set showed that for the entire year, 1878 was the warmest year prior to 1980. But now NASA conveniently hides all temperatures before 1880. The blue line in this graph shows a version of NASA global temperatures from the year 2000, and the red line shows a version from the year 2017. Both lines show the 5-year centered mean of the annual average temperatures. The 2000 version started in the 1860s and showed about half a degree warming prior to the year 2000. However, the recent version of NASA global temperature starts in the year 1880 and shows a total of about 1.2 degrees warming prior to the year 2000. So NASA has more than doubled global warming prior to the year 2000 by hiding the hot data before 1880, by cooling past temperatures, and by warming recent temperatures. So they've used 3 impressive techniques of data fraud in order to achieve their hockey stick. Now let's look at what they're hiding from before the year 1880. The Northern Hemisphere winter and Southern Hemisphere summer of 1877 to 1878 was epic. The Clarence and Richmond Examiner, Saturday, January 19th, 1878. The weather here is frightful. The thermometer for 4 days has been 110 degrees in the shade. The magpies and the other birds are so much affected by the heat that they are dropping off the trees. Others are leaving the bush and taking shelter in the houses of settlers. At Bourke, New South Wales yesterday, the heat was 122 degrees in the shade. The fowls are dropping dead in large numbers. There is no sign of rain and no cattle are traveling. The article goes on with stories like this from all over Australia. Here's another story from Australia from February 1878. Meteorology for January. The month of January has been by far the hottest ever recollected in the district. This, together with the absence of heavy rains during the last winter, has caused the ground in all places to become so dry that vegetation only exists in the name. So you can see there was a terrible drought at the time too, which I'll be discussing later. This graph shows the incredible record temperatures during January 1878 at the Bathurst Jail. Peak temperature was 112 degrees Fahrenheit on January 12, 1878. Deniliquin got up to 122 degrees during that heat wave, their hottest temperature ever recorded. Here's another story from February 1878. The month of January 1878 will be long remembered by the farming community as a period of heat and drought scarcely ever known or experienced in this colony before. On Thursday the 10th last, the heat was most intense, the thermometer registering 123 degrees in the shade and 158 degrees in the sun. The heat wave continued through February. The Sydney Morning Herald, Saturday, February 23, 1878. 4 sudden deaths at Rockhampton of well-known residents are reported today. The deaths are attributed to the extreme heat. This letter to the editor from May 1878 was a discussion of the extreme heat of that year and some prior years. During the past summer, some of your correspondents in the country have telegraphed respecting extraordinary heat experienced in various parts of New South Wales. And here's another story from January 1878 discussing the excessive heat and deaths owing to the excessive heat. This graph shows peak temperatures in Australia during January 1878. You can see that almost every day was over 100 degrees, and several days were over 120 degrees. Meanwhile, on the other side of the pond, Minnesota did not have a winter during 1877 to 1878. This article is from the Minneapolis Tribune, March 19, 1878. Observations on the weather have been kept at Fort Snelling since 1819. There is nothing in the memory of the living or the records of the dead that give us such a winter and spring as we have passed in the last 4 or 5 months. Indeed, we've had no winter weather in Minnesota, and the first spring month thus far has been more like May than March. A winter without snow or cold weather was among the things unlooked for in this North Star state. Here's a story from Vermont, the Burlington Free Press, March 6, 1878. The late warm weather has hatched out large numbers of grasshoppers, and they are on a lively hop over the meadows. In our current climate, we would normally expect Vermont to be covered with snow in early March, not grasshoppers hopping around meadows. I worked in Connecticut during March 2011, and this is what I saw on my bicycle commute between Danbury and Sandy Hook. The temperature was below freezing, and I don't remember seeing any grasshoppers. Here's a story from North Carolina from early March 1878. The warm weather. The past 10 days has brought to us particularly warm weather, and the result is that the leaves and blossoms of fruit trees are growing rapidly. And they were concerned that the early warm weather was going to ruin the fruit crop. Here's one from the Chicago Tribune, March 4th, 1878. A strange winter is the exclamation on every tongue. Strange and wonderful it has been and still continues to be. The very oldest inhabitant, searching his memory through, can remember no other like it. There's been as warm weather before, but not so much of it. This was back in the days when newspapers would talk to old people about climate rather than 16-year-old middle school dropouts. And the following summer brought tremendous heat waves to the United States too. Many deaths in the Midwest reported at St. Louis. And another story about the heat wave and numerous fatalities in the U.S. during the summer of 1878. Here's an interesting story from 1878. A thermometer belonging to Jason Case during the warm weather of the past week went up to 220 degrees in the shade and exploded. I suspect they meant 120 degrees. And people in Ohio had run out of ice because there was so little ice stored in their ice houses from the past winter. So what caused this incredible heat wave and drought of 1878? Here's an article from the Minneapolis Tribune from January 3rd, 1878. A Kentucky philosopher announces that the remarkably warm weather in this country during December was the direct result of the war in Europe. Heavy cannon fire, he states, causes the Arctic currents to float to the place of firing, producing cold weather there and warm weather on the other side of the world. That theory sounds ridiculous, but is it any more ridiculous than what climate alarmists blame warm temperatures on now? They believe that a 1 part per 10,000 increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide over the past century is going to cause all life on Earth to become extinct. To put that in perspective, the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide over the past century is the equivalent of packing an extra 2 people into Madison Square Garden. The cannon fire theory from 1878 is just about as credible as the current theory coming from climate alarmists. So now let's look at some actual science. This paper was published in the Journal of Meteorology in December 2018. The paper is titled Climate and the Global Famine of 1876 to 1878. From 1875 to 1878, concurrent multi-year droughts in Asia, Brazil, and Africa, referred to as the Great Drought, caused widespread crop failures, catalyzing the so-called global famine, which had fatalities exceeding 50 million people. The extreme severity, duration, and extent of this global event is associated with an extraordinary combination of preceding cool tropical Pacific conditions, 1870 to 1876, a record-breaking El Nino, 1877 to 1878, a record-strong Indian Ocean dipole, 1877, and record-warm North Atlantic Ocean, 1878 conditions. Climatic conditions that caused the Great Drought and global famine arose from natural variability. So the hottest month on record, March 1878, was driven by natural variability, not carbon dioxide. So how did NASA handle this? They simply erased all the data before 1880. They made it disappear. The 50 million people who died in the drought simply disappeared from NASA's history. Holocaust deniers tried to erase the deaths of about 10 million people, but NASA erased about 50 million deaths. The Australian Bureau of Meteorology is even worse. They hide all data before 1910, which was extremely hot in Australia. Look how much hotter temperatures were at Deniliquin prior to 1910. This graph shows the percent of days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius at all long-term Australian Global Historical Climatology Network stations. So it's easy to see what the Bureau of Meteorology is hiding before 1910, extreme heat in Australia. Australia's worst drought, the Federation drought, occurred around the turn of the century between the 19th and 20th centuries, and that drought has been erased from Australia's temperature record. Climate alarmists like to make appeals to authority about NASA, saying, how can you question them? They're the people who went to the moon. But the truth is that a lot of the people who went to the moon believe the same things that I do. NASA global warming stance blasted by 49 astronaut scientists who once worked at agency. Is NASA playing fast and loose with climate change science? That's the contention of a group of 49 former NASA scientists and astronauts. On March 28, 2012, the group sent a letter to NASA Administrator Charles Bolden Jr., blasting the agency for making unwarranted claims about the role of carbon dioxide in global warming. We believe the claims by NASA and the Goddard Institute for Space Studies that man-made carbon dioxide is having a catastrophic impact on global climate change are not substantiated, especially when considering thousands of years of empirical data, the group wrote. With hundreds of well-known climate scientists and tens of thousands of other scientists publicly declaring their disbelief in the catastrophic forecast, coming particularly from the GIST leadership, it's clear that the science is not settled. So the people with the right stuff who took us to the moon and tens of thousands of other scientists are being ignored. And the hot temperatures from the past are also being ignored and tampered with. What we're seeing is the biggest fraud in science history. And the press, politicians, and many people in the academic community are complicit. And this fraudulent temperature record has become the basis of the EPA's CO2 endangerment finding, which threatens our country's economy and our future. If you want to scare children like Greta, you can't let her know about the 50 million people who died during the incredible heat wave and drought of 1878. She travels across the ocean in multi-million-dollar yachts and imagines that she faces the worst conditions any child has ever faced. And it's not her fault. That's what she's been taught by her parents, her teachers, her governmental authorities, and the press. We need to get the fraud and the temperature record stopped, and we need to get the CO2 endangerment finding thrown out. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time. Hello, this is Tony Heller from realclimatescience.com, setting the record straight about climate. One of the core beliefs of climate alarmists is that the oceans are becoming acidic as a result of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They call this ocean acidification. The point being to create primal fear that you're going to be boiled alive by acid. Let's read the description in Wikipedia. Ocean acidification is the ongoing decrease in the pH of the Earth's oceans, caused by the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Seawater is slightly basic, meaning pH greater than 7, and ocean acidification involves a shift towards pH neutral conditions rather than a transition to acidic conditions. An estimated 30 to 40% of the carbon dioxide from human activity released into the atmosphere dissolves into oceans, rivers, and lakes. To achieve chemical equilibrium, some of it reacts with the water to form carbonic acid. Some of the resulting carbonic acid molecules dissociate into a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, thus increasing ocean acidity. Between 1751 and 1996, surface ocean pH is estimated to have decreased from approximately 8.25 to 8.14, representing an increase of almost 30% in H+ ion concentration in the world's oceans. Earth system models project that by around 2008, ocean acidity exceeded historical analogs, and in combination with other ocean biogeochemical changes, could undermine the functioning of marine ecosystems and disrupt the provision of many goods and services associated with the ocean beginning as early as 2100. Note that I highlighted the words estimated, models project, and could undermine. As with almost everything else climate alarmists believe in, their belief system about ocean acidification is based on models. Now let's take a look at the real world. My undergraduate degree is in geology from Arizona State University, and then I went into the master's program in geochemistry at the University of New Mexico. This picture of the university was taken a little before my time. I'm not quite that old. I didn't finish up my master's program in geochemistry at the university and instead went off to be a wilderness ranger in the nearby Sandia Mountains. That was great fun, and then I spent the next few years working as a wilderness ranger, running movie theaters, and working as a school teacher. But I did learn quite a bit of geochemistry during my time at the University of New Mexico. Let's look at the Wikipedia claim again. Surface ocean pH is estimated to have decreased from 8.25 to 8.14. Now let's look at some actual measured ocean pH data from Monterey Bay. As you can see, ocean pH varies a lot from week to week. During the time they were taking the measurements in Monterey Bay, it varied from about 7.7 up to 8.1. Now let's look at the claim Wikipedia is making about the change since the 18th century. I superimposed it here as the pink bar. As you can see, week-to-week changes are larger than the claimed change since the 18th century. Nobody really knows what the average pH of the ocean is now, much less back in the 18th century. But the claimed change since the 18th century is much less than the week-to-week noise. This gives us a very strong hint that the whole thing is just more model-based nonsense. Carbon dioxide levels on Earth for most of the last 600 million years were much higher than they are now. Corals and shellfish evolved during the Cambrian era when CO2 levels were nearly 20 times as high as they are now. If we look over here on this geological time chart, it says Cambrian era, abundant life in the seas. If ocean acidification was the real problem, there wouldn't have been any life in the seas, much less abundant life in the seas.